Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What if the walls of your dream home held memories that refused to stay buried? The moment I saw the pink Victorian house nestled at the end of the oak line driveway, I felt a strange mixture of elation and unease. It was everything Melissa and I had dreamed of: charming gingerbread trim, a wraparound porch with delicate white railings, and that distinctive rose-colored exterior that made it stand out among the more conventional homes in this sleepy Georgia town. "It's perfect, Jack," Melissa whispered, squeezing my hand as our realtor, Mrs. Patterson, fumbled with the lockbox. Our 8-year-old daughter Emma was already racing around the yard, her laughter echoing across the sprawling lawn. The asking price had been surprisingly low for a house this size. A motivated seller, Mrs. Patterson had explained with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Later, she mentioned something about the previous owners relocating suddenly after only 6 months. I should have asked more questions. The interior of the house was even more impressive than its exterior: high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and ornate crown molding throughout. The kitchen had been recently updated with modern appliances, and the master bedroom featured a bay window overlooking the backyard garden. It felt like we had stumbled upon a hidden treasure, something far beyond what we could afford on my professor's salary. "And here's the basement," Mrs. Patterson said, opening a door off the kitchen that revealed a steep staircase. "It's unfinished, but it offers plenty of storage space." I followed her down the creaking steps, feeling a noticeable drop in temperature as we descended. The basement was large and dark, with a few small windows near the ceiling allowing minimal light to filter through. The concrete floor was stained in places, and the far corner housed an old coal furnace that had long been replaced by a modern HVAC system. "What's that door?" I asked, pointing to a heavy wooden door set into the far wall. "Oh, just a storage room," Mrs. Patterson replied quickly. "The previous owners used it for preserves and such. Typical root cellar." She turned away before I could ask more questions, her heels clicking rapidly across the concrete floor as she headed back upstairs. We moved in 3 weeks later, delighted with our good fortune. The university was only a 15-minute drive away, and Emma's new school was even closer. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, though I noticed they kept a certain distance. Mrs. Holloway from next door brought over a welcome basket filled with homemade jam and fresh bread, but declined our invitation to come inside for coffee. "This house," she said, her eyes darting to the upper windows, "has quite a history." "Oh, is it very old?" Melissa asked, intrigued. "Not the age so much as, well, you know how small towns talk," Mrs. Holloway replied vaguely. "Enjoy the jam." "It's blackberry, picked them myself." The first few nights passed uneventfully. We settled into our new routines, unpacked boxes, and arranged furniture. I found myself drawn to the basement, though I couldn't explain why. Something about its cool darkness felt inviting and repellent in equal measure. I set up a small workbench down there, telling myself it would be a good place to grade papers away from the household noise. It was during our 4th night in the house when I first heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind the wooden door in the basement. I had been working late, organizing my syllabus for the upcoming semester, when the sound cut through the silence. At first, I thought it might be mice, but as I approached the door, the scratching stopped, replaced by something that sounded disturbingly like a whimper. Hello? I called out, feeling immediately foolish. Of course, no one answered. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I hadn't noticed a keyhole before, but now I saw a small brass lock set into the aged wood. I made a mental note to ask Melissa if she'd seen any extra keys during the unpacking. As I turned to head back upstairs, the temperature in the basement seemed to drop several degrees. The light from my desk lamp flickered briefly, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall that didn't correspond to any object in the room. That night, I dreamed of the basement door. In my dream, it was slightly ajar, a thin line of reddish light seeping through the crack. From behind it came voices, soft, pleading voices calling my name. I woke up covered in sweat, Melissa sleeping peacefully beside me. The next morning, over coffee, I casually mentioned the locked door to Melissa. Did Mrs. Patterson give us a key for it? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. For what door? Melissa looked up from her newspaper, brow furrowed. The storage room in the basement. It's locked. I didn't notice any locked door, she said. But I haven't spent much time down there. It's kind of, I don't know, oppressive. I'll ask around, I said. Maybe the previous owners left a key with one of the neighbors. Later that day, I ran into Mr. Fletcher, an elderly man who lived across the street. When I mentioned our new house, his expression clouded. The Keller place, he said, nodding slowly. Been through several owners these past few years. Do you know anything about the basement? I asked. There's a locked door down there. Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. I wouldn't mess with that, he said after a long pause. Some doors are better left closed, if you understand my meaning. I laughed, but the sound felt hollow even to my own ears. Now you've got me curious. The Hendersons, they were the owners before the last folks. They claimed to hear things. Voices. Crying. Fletcher cleared his throat uncomfortably. Course, they were drinkers. Everybody knew that. As I walked back home, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across our pink house, making it look suddenly garish rather than charming. For the first time, I wondered if we had made a mistake. That night, after Melissa and Emma were asleep, I returned to the basement. The air felt heavier than before, thick with an unidentifiable odor, something like damp earth and copper. The locked door stood as I had left it, but now I noticed dark stains around its edges that I hadn't seen before. Water damage, most likely. As I approached the door, my flashlight beam wavering slightly, I heard it again, a soft, muffled sound from the other side. Not scratching this time, but a voice, a human voice, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. My heart hammering in my chest, I pressed my ear against the wood. Help, came the faint, unmistakable plea. Please help us. I jerked away from the door as if it had burned me, dropping my flashlight. It clattered against the concrete floor, rolling in a semicircle before coming to rest with its beam pointing at the basement stairs. The shadows it cast stretched up the wall like elongated fingers. Hello? I called again, my voice cracking. Is someone in there? Silence answered me, so profound I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. I retrieved my flashlight with trembling hands and tried the door handle again, rattling it with increasing desperation. The lock held firm. I ran upstairs, taking the steps two at a time, and grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated, finger hovering over the dial pad. What would I tell them? that I heard voices behind a locked door in my basement, that my elderly neighbor had shared vague rumors about the previous owners. Instead, I searched online for information about our house. The listing had mentioned it was built in 1896 by a local cotton merchant, but little else about its history. After an hour of digging through local newspaper archives, I found a small article from 3 years ago mentioning a police investigation at our address following reports of suspicious activity. No details, no follow-up articles. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle around me. Old houses make noise, I told myself. Pipes contract, wood expands and shrinks. Perfectly normal explanations existed for everything I'd experienced. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of that voice, that desperate, human plea for help. Morning brought clarity with its golden light. I felt foolish about my midnight anxieties as I prepared breakfast for Emma before her first day at her new school. Melissa kissed us both goodbye before heading to her job at the local library, and I promised to pick up Emma at 3. "Daddy," Emma said as I was helping her with her backpack, "who lives in our basement?" The question froze me in place. "No one lives in our basement, sweetie." "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged, her small face serious. "I heard them talking last night. They were crying." "It was probably just a dream," I said, forcing a smile. "Or maybe the house making noises. Old houses do that." Emma looked unconvinced but didn't argue. As we walked to the car, she glanced back at the house, her eyes drawn to the small basement windows partially visible above the foundation. After dropping Emma off, I drove to the county records office instead of heading to my campus office as planned. The clerk seemed unsurprised by my request for information about the property. "The old Keller house," she said, nodding. "Give me a few minutes." She returned with a thin folder containing property deeds and tax records. Nothing unusual until I noticed a gap in ownership between 2013 and 2015. "What happened during these years?" I asked. The clerk adjusted her glasses. "Bank foreclosure, I believe. Stood empty for a while." "And before that?" "The Kellers? Elderly couple. Moved to Florida." She hesitated. "There was some trouble with the place after they left. Squatters, maybe. Police were called a few times." I thanked her and left, feeling no closer to understanding what I had heard in the basement. On an impulse, I drove to the local hardware store and purchased a heavy-duty bolt cutter. If there was something, or someone, behind that door, I needed to know. When I returned home, the pink house stood innocent in the midday sun, its gingerbread trim casting delicate shadows across the porch. Nothing about its charming exterior suggested darkness or secrets. Yet as I approached the front door, key in hand, I could have sworn I saw movement behind one of the basement windows, a pale face pressed briefly against the glass before disappearing. Inside, the house was quiet and still. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains Melissa had hung in the living room, creating patterns on the hardwood floor. Everything looked normal, peaceful. I almost convinced myself to forget the whole thing, to return the bolt cutters and dismiss last night's experience as imagination. Instead, I found myself descending the basement stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air grew cooler as I reached the bottom, that same earthy, coppery smell filling my nostrils. The locked door stood at the far end, innocuous in the daylight filtering through the small windows. I approached it slowly, bolt cutters in hand. Before I could talk myself out of it, I positioned the blades around the brass lock and squeezed the handles with all my strength. The lock resisted for a moment, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the basement. The door remained closed. I stood there for several long seconds, heart pounding, before reaching for the handle. It turned easily now, the door swinging inward with a low creak of hinges long unused. Darkness greeted me. I fumbled for my flashlight and pointed the beam into the space beyond. It was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with earthen walls and a packed dirt floor. Empty. Completely empty. I stepped inside, sweeping the flashlight beam across every corner. There were no signs of recent occupation, no evidence that anyone had been locked in here. The only notable features were some old shelves built into one wall and what appeared to be scratch marks along the base of another. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by embarrassment. Of course, there was no one trapped in here. What had I been thinking? The voice I heard, if I heard anything at all, must have come from outside, perhaps carried through the small windows from the street. As I turned to leave, my flashlight illuminated something I had missed, a trapdoor set into the floor in the center of the room. It was flush with the dirt, its edges barely visible, with an iron ring handle partially buried. My relief evaporated. I knelt beside the trapdoor, brushing away the loose soil that partially covered it. The iron ring was cold to the touch as I grasped it and pulled. The door lifted with surprising ease, revealing a black void below and the top of a ladder descending into darkness. A wave of cold air rose from the opening, carrying with it a stench so foul I recoiled, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve. It was the smell of decay, of things long dead and rotting. "Hello?" I called into the darkness, my voice echoing strangely. "Is anyone down there?" No answer came, yet as I leaned closer, training my flashlight into the pit, I thought I detected movement. Something shifting in the darkness beyond the reach of my light. I should have closed the trapdoor right then. I should have run upstairs, called the police, and waited safely in the sunlight. Instead, I placed one foot on the ladder and began to descend. The ladder was wooden and felt damp beneath my hands. It creaked ominously with each step, but held my weight. The smell grew worse as I descended, and the temperature dropped noticeably. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the thick darkness. I had gone down perhaps 15 rungs when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound directly below me. I froze, pointing my flashlight downward. The beam caught something moving, something pale that darted quickly out of sight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice tight with fear. A whisper answered me, so faint I couldn't make out the words. Then another, joining the first, and another, until it seemed a chorus of ghostly voices surrounded me, rising from the darkness below. Panic seized me. I scrambled back up the ladder, nearly losing my grip in my haste. As I reached the top, something cold brushed against my ankle, a touch so light it might have been imagination, yet it sent icy terror through my veins. I hauled myself out of the trapdoor opening and slammed it shut, then backed away until I hit the wall. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, and my breath came in ragged gasps. For several minutes, I sat there in the empty room, trying to calm myself. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the house connected to old tunnels or a disused well. The voices could have been water pipes, the touch merely a draft. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever lurked beneath the trapdoor was neither imaginary nor easily explained away. I left the room, closing the door behind me but leaving it unlocked. What good would locking it do now? I returned upstairs to shower, desperate to wash away the cloying smell that seemed to cling to my clothes and skin. As the hot water cascaded over me, I tried to decide what to do. Tell Melissa? Call the police? Pretend I had discovered nothing and go about my life? I was still deliberating when I heard Emma's voice from downstairs. I glanced at my watch. It was already after 3. I had lost track of time completely. Hastily wrapping a towel around myself, I called out, "Be right there, honey. Just finishing a shower." "It's okay, Daddy," she called back. "I'm going to the basement to see the people." Ice formed in my veins. I threw on clothes with shaking hands and raced downstairs, calling Emma's name. The basement door stood open, and I could hear her voice from below, speaking in the sing-song tone she used with her dolls. "Emma!" I shouted, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Emma, come back up here right now." I found her standing in front of the storage room, its door now slightly ajar. She turned to me, smiling innocently. "They're hungry, Daddy," she said simply. "They told me they haven't eaten in a very long time." I snatched Emma up into my arms, my heart thundering against my ribs. She squirmed in protest, but I held her tight as I backed away from the partially open door. "What people, Emma?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice calm. "Who are you talking to?" "The people under the floor," she replied matter-of-factly. "They said they used to live here, but the bad man put them down there and wouldn't let them out." A chill ran through me. Did they tell you their names?" Emma nodded. "There's Daniel and Maria and a little boy named Thomas. They said there used to be more, but they got quiet." I carried Emma upstairs, setting her at the kitchen table with cookies and milk while my mind raced. Children have active imaginations. I knew this. She could have overheard my conversation with Mr. Fletcher or picked up on my own anxiety about the basement. But how had she known about the room, about what lay beneath the trapdoor? "Stay here," I told her firmly. "I need to make a phone call. Don't go downstairs again, okay? Promise me." "But they're hungry," Emma insisted, her lower lip protruding in a pout. "Emma, promise me." She sighed dramatically. "I promise." I stepped into the living room and called Melissa, who agreed to come home early. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher listened patiently as I stumbled through an explanation about finding a hidden room and possible evidence of what? I wasn't even sure what I was reporting. "I'll send an officer to take a look," she said eventually. "Should be there within the hour." I hung up, feeling marginally better. Soon there would be other adults here, rational people who could help make sense of what I'd found. While waiting, I tried to extract more information from Emma, but she had already moved on, her attention captured by a cartoon playing on the tablet. Children's mercurial focus, normally frustrating, now seemed a blessing. Melissa arrived home first, her face tight with concern. I pulled her into the kitchen and explained in hushed tones what I had discovered, what Emma had said. "Jack, this is insane," she whispered, glancing toward the living room where Emma remained absorbed in her show. "Hidden rooms? Voices? Do you hear yourself?" "I know how it sounds," I admitted. "But I need you to trust me. There's something wrong with this house, with that room. I've called the police." "You what?" Her eyes widened. "What exactly do you think they're going to find? What do you think happened here?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Officer Dawson was a young man with a patient expression that suggested he dealt with paranoid homeowners on a regular basis. He listened to my story without interruption, then asked to see the basement. "I'll take a look," he said, but I should warn you, these old houses often have cisterns or coal chutes that can seem suspicious if you're not familiar with historic architecture. I led him downstairs, relieved to have someone else with me. The storage room door remained as I had left it, slightly ajar. Officer Dawson pushed it open and swept his flashlight around the empty space. "Where's this trapdoor?" he asked. I pointed to the center of the dirt floor, then frowned. The iron ring was no longer visible. I knelt down, brushing away the loose soil where I was certain the trapdoor had been, but found only packed earth. "It was right here," I insisted, digging now with my fingers. A wooden door with an iron handle. I opened it. There was a ladder going down. Officer Dawson watched me with growing skepticism. "Sir, I don't see any evidence of a trapdoor or recent digging." "That's impossible. I was just here, just a few hours ago." My voice had taken on a desperate edge that made me wince. I heard voices. My daughter heard them too. "Kids pick up on their parents' anxieties," Dawson said gently. "And old houses make all kinds of noises that can sound human to the unfamiliar ear." I sat back on my heels, staring at the undisturbed dirt floor. Had I imagined it all? The trapdoor, the ladder, the whispers in the darkness? "Look," Dawson continued, "I understand moving into a new place can be stressful. Maybe there was an old entrance to a cellar or cistern that was sealed up by previous owners. These old houses have lots of quirks." I nodded numbly, suddenly unsure of everything I had experienced. We returned upstairs where Melissa waited, her expression a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Everything okay?" she asked, though the answer was clearly no. "Just an old storage room," Officer Dawson replied cheerfully. "Pretty common in these historic homes. Nothing to worry about." After he left, Melissa didn't question me further, but I could feel her watching me closely throughout dinner, during Emma's bath time, as we settled in for the night. Her silence was more unsettling than any accusation would have been. "I'm not crazy," I said into the darkness of our bedroom, long after we had turned out the lights. "I know what I saw, what I heard." "I believe that you believe it," she replied carefully. "But maybe you should talk to someone. The move, starting a new job, it's a lot of stress." I turned away from her, staring at the wall. Sleep eluded me for hours, and when it finally came, it brought dreams worse than wakefulness. In my dream, I was back on the ladder, descending into darkness. But this time, I reached the bottom. A tunnel stretched before me, its walls pressing close on either side. As I moved forward, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were calling my name, beckoning me deeper. The tunnel opened into a chamber where pale figures huddled in the corners, men, women, children. Their eyes reflected my flashlight beam like those of nocturnal animals. One detached from the group and approached me, a woman with long dark hair and hollow cheeks. "You're not him," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "You're not the keeper." "Who is the keeper?" I asked. She smiled, revealing blackened gums. "He finds us, brings us down, feeds us sometimes." Her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "But you'll join us soon. All who live in the pink house do, eventually." I woke with a strangled cry, sweat-soaked and trembling. Melissa stirred beside me but didn't wake. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m., the dead of night. From somewhere below came the unmistakable sound of the basement door opening. I sat up, straining to listen. Soft footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above the basement. "Emma." It had to be Emma. I slipped out of bed and moved silently to the hallway. Emma's bedroom door stood open, her bed empty. Fear gripped me as I hurried downstairs. The basement door was indeed open, darkness yawning beyond. I flipped on the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out, or the bulb had burned out. Either way, I was faced with descending those stairs in darkness. Emma? I called softly, not wanting to wake Melissa. No answer came. I retrieved my phone from the kitchen counter and activated its flashlight before cautiously making my way down the stairs. Each step creaked loudly in the silent house, announcing my descent. The basement was empty, the storage room door closed. I approached it slowly, dread building with each step. When I reached for the handle, I found it ice cold to the touch. Emma? I called again, pushing the door open. The room beyond was no longer empty. The dirt floor had been disturbed, revealing the trapdoor once more. It stood open, a black mouth leading to the depths below. Beside it knelt Emma in her nightgown, whispering down into the darkness. Emma! I rushed forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. What are you doing? Get away from there. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unfocused. They're so hungry, Daddy. They said if I help them, they'll let me play with Thomas. There is no Thomas, I said firmly, pulling her away from the opening. We're going upstairs right now. As I lifted her into my arms, a hand, gray-skinned and skeletal, emerged from the trapdoor and grasped at the edge. Another followed, and then a head began to rise into view, a gaunt face with sunken eyes and stretched skin. I stumbled backward, clutching Emma tightly. The figure continued to emerge, pulling itself up with jerky, unnatural movements. It was a man, or had been once, dressed in tattered clothes that hung from his emaciated frame. Keeper, it rasped, focusing those hollow eyes on me. You're not the keeper. More hands appeared at the edge of the trapdoor, more figures beginning to climb out. I turned and ran, Emma held tightly against my chest. Behind us came shuffling footsteps and whispering voices, growing louder and more numerous. I slammed the storage room door shut behind us and fled across the basement to the stairs. As we ascended, the light from my phone illuminated the basement door at the top, swinging closed. No! I lunged forward, taking the last few steps in a desperate leap, but too late. The door closed with a final sounding click, and when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Melissa! I shouted, pounding on the door. Melissa, wake up. We're trapped down here. No response came from above. I set Emma down on the stairs and threw my shoulder against the door repeatedly, but it held firm. They're coming, Daddy, Emma whispered, her small face pale in the phone's light. I turned to see the storage room door slowly swinging open. Dark figures spilled out, their movements jerky and wrong, their whispers filling the basement with a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Stay behind me, I told Emma, positioning myself between her and the approaching figures. The nearest one, a woman with a partially caved-in skull, reached out a gray hand toward us. You live in the pink house now, she said, her voice a hollow echo. You belong with us. We're not staying, I said, as if reasoning with these apparitions might help. We're leaving this house. No one leaves, came another voice from the shambling group. The keeper makes sure of that. My phone's light began to flicker, the battery failing at the worst possible moment. In its dying glow, I saw dozens of figures now, filling the basement, approaching from all sides. Some wore modern clothes, others garments from decades past. All bore the marks of violence, bruises around necks, gaping wounds, missing limbs. As the light failed completely, plunging us into darkness, Emma's small hand found mine. "It's okay, Daddy," she said calmly. "Thomas says we won't hurt much." Not like they did. Her hand felt different in mine, colder, the fingers longer than they should be. I tried to pull away, but she held on with unnatural strength. In the absolute darkness, surrounded by the whispers of the dead, I felt other hands reaching for me, touching my face, my neck, my clothes. Cold, dry hands that pulled me gently but inexorably down toward the floor. The last thing I heard before consciousness fled was Emma's voice, but changed, deeper and older than it should have been, saying, "Welcome home, Daddy. Welcome to the pink house." I awoke to sunlight streaming through our bedroom window, momentarily disoriented. Melissa lay beside me, still sleeping peacefully. Had it all been a nightmare? The trapdoor, the figures in the dark, Emma's changed voice? I slipped out of bed and hurried to Emma's room, my heart in my throat. She was there, curled up beneath her unicorn comforter, breathing deeply. I stood watching her for a long moment, reassuring myself that she was real, that she was safe. But the relief was short-lived. As I turned to leave, I noticed dirt on the floor beside her bed, dark soil like that from the basement room. And her fingernails, visible where her hand rested on the pillow, were caked with the same dirt. Not a dream, then. Something had happened last night, something I couldn't fully remember or understand. How had we gotten back to our beds? Who or what had put us there? I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head. In the mirror, my reflection looked haggard, with dark circles under my eyes. As I reached for a towel, I noticed marks on my wrist, 5 small bruises in a distinct pattern of fingerprints. Downstairs, the basement door was closed. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to be locked, but the handle turned easily in my grip. Morning light spilled down the stairs, making the basement look ordinary, even benign. I descended slowly, each creaking step bringing back flashes of the previous night's terror. The storage room door stood open. Inside, the dirt floor was smooth and undisturbed, no sign of the trapdoor that had been there twice now, by my reckoning. I knelt, running my hands over the packed earth, finding nothing. What's happening to me? I whispered to the empty room. As if in answer, the temperature dropped suddenly, my breath fogging in the air. A whisper came from just behind me, so close I felt it against my ear. "She's chosen." I whirled around, but the room was empty. The cold dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving me alone with my racing heart and trembling hands. Upstairs, I found Melissa in the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself. She smiled when she saw me, but the expression faltered as she took in my appearance. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring coffee into a mug and sliding it toward me. I considered telling her everything, the figures in the basement, Emma's strange behavior, the whispered voice just moments ago. But what good would it do? She already thought I was stressed to the point of hallucination. "Just couldn't sleep," I said instead, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Well, I have news that might perk you up," Melissa said, turning back to the stove. "I was chatting with Diane at the library yesterday, and she mentioned knowing the previous owners, the ones before the last couple. The Hendersons." My hand froze halfway to my mouth. "What did she say about them?" "They're still in town, apparently. Moved to an apartment complex on the east side." She glanced at me over her shoulder. "I thought maybe we could reach out to them, ask about the house. Might put your mind at ease." It was the last thing I expected her to suggest. You'd be okay with that? She shrugged. Seems harmless enough. And if it helps you sleep better. I set down my coffee cup with a decided thump. Let's go today. Saturday, they should be home, right? Melissa raised an eyebrow at my eagerness, but nodded. I'll see if Diane can give us their contact information. 2 hours later, we were sitting in the modest living room of Robert and June Henderson's apartment, Emma having been left with Mrs. Holloway for a play date, but I wondered if our neighbor knew what she was getting into. The Hendersons were in their 60s, both thin and nervous looking. June's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. We don't talk about that house, Robert said bluntly after I explained why we had come. Left some things behind when we moved, but they weren't worth going back for. We heard you experience some unusual things while living there, I pressed gently. June and Robert exchanged glances. Finally, June set down her teacup with a decisive click against its saucer. You've heard them, haven't you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The voices in the basement. I nodded, relief washing over me at this confirmation. Yes. And more. Robert leaned forward, his expression grave. How's your little girl? The question caught me off guard. Emma? She's fine. Why? Children are more susceptible, June said. They see them more clearly. Communicate with them. Who are they? Melissa asked, skepticism evident in her tone despite her earlier support. Robert sighed heavily. We're not sure how it started. Local legend says the original owner, Keller, was taking in boarders back in the early 1900s. People passing through town, looking for work. Some never left. Because he killed them, June added matter-of-factly. Kept them in the basement. Not all at once, mind you. Over decades. I felt a chill run down my spine. But that would have been discovered, surely? The police. Different times, Robert interrupted. And Keller was respected, wealthy. No one questioned him. The house passed through his family, June continued. The terrible practice continued. Not with every owner, but enough of them. Always a Keller descendant, always the same pattern. What pattern? I asked, dreading the answer. They're called keepers, Robert explained. They maintain the house, feed what's beneath it. Every few years, they add to the collection. This is insane, Melissa murmured, but her face had gone pale. The last known keeper was Martin Keller, June said. He sold the house in 2012 after his wife became suspicious. We bought it, not knowing. And the voices started, Robert continued. At first, just whispers. Then crying. Begging. They wanted to be fed. Fed what? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Blood, June whispered. Fresh meat. Life. Melissa stood abruptly. I think we should go. Thank you for your time, but this is... You need to listen, Robert insisted, his voice rising. The house chooses new keepers when the old ones leave. It needs someone to care for those below. They'll take your daughter, June added, her eyes locked on mine. They choose children first, more innocent, more receptive. They'll speak to her, show themselves to her. Eventually, they'll change her. My blood ran cold as I remembered Emma's words from the night before. Thomas says we won't hurt much. Not like they did. How do we stop it? I asked, ignoring Melissa's incredulous stare. You can't, Robert said simply. Once it starts, there's only one way out. Burn it, June whispered. Burn the house to the ground. Just couldn't sleep, I said instead, accepting the coffee gratefully. Well, I have news that might perk you up, Melissa said, turning back to the stove. I was chatting with Diane at the library yesterday, and she mentioned knowing the previous owners, the ones before the last couple. The Hendersons. My hand froze halfway to my mouth. What did she say about them? They're still in town, apparently. Moved to an apartment complex on the east side. She glanced at me over her shoulder. I thought maybe we could reach out to them, ask about the house. Might put your mind at ease. It was the last thing I expected her to suggest. You'd be okay with that? She shrugged. Seems harmless enough. And if it helps you sleep better. I set down my coffee cup with a decided thump. Let's go today. Saturday, they should be home, right? Melissa raised an eyebrow at my eagerness, but nodded. I'll see if Diane can give us their contact information. 2 hours later, we were sitting in the modest living room of Robert and June Henderson's apartment, Emma having been left with Mrs. Holloway for a play date, but I wondered if our neighbor knew what she was getting into. The Hendersons were in their 60s, both thin and nervous looking. June's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. We don't talk about that house, Robert said bluntly after I explained why we had come. Left some things behind when we moved, but they weren't worth going back for. We heard you experience some unusual things while living there, I pressed gently. June and Robert exchanged glances. Finally, June set down her teacup with a decisive click against its saucer. You've heard them, haven't you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The voices in the basement. I nodded, relief washing over me at this confirmation. Yes. And more. Robert leaned forward, his expression grave. How's your little girl? The question caught me off guard. Emma? She's fine. Why? Children are more susceptible, June said. They see them more clearly. Communicate with them. Who are they? Melissa asked, skepticism evident in her tone despite her earlier support. Robert sighed heavily. We're not sure how it started. Local legend says the original owner, Keller, was taking in boarders back in the early 1900s. People passing through town, looking for work. Some never left. Because he killed them, June added matter-of-factly. Kept them in the basement. Not all at once, mind you. Over decades. I felt a chill run down my spine. But that would have been discovered, surely? The police. Different times, Robert interrupted. And Keller was respected, wealthy. No one questioned him. The house passed through his family, June continued. The terrible practice continued. Not with every owner, but enough of them. Always a Keller descendant, always the same pattern. What pattern? I asked, dreading the answer. They're called keepers, Robert explained. They maintain the house, feed what's beneath it. Every few years, they add to the collection. This is insane, Melissa murmured, but her face had gone pale. The last known keeper was Martin Keller, June said. He sold the house in 2012 after his wife became suspicious. We bought it, not knowing. And the voices started, Robert continued. At first, just whispers. Then crying. Begging. They wanted to be fed. Fed what? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Blood, June whispered. Fresh meat. Life. Melissa stood abruptly. I think we should go. Thank you for your time, but this is... You need to listen, Robert insisted, his voice rising. The house chooses new keepers when the old ones leave. It needs someone to care for those below. They'll take your daughter, June added, her eyes locked on mine. They choose children first, more innocent, more receptive. They'll speak to her, show themselves to her. Eventually, they'll change her. My blood ran cold as I remembered Emma's words from the night before. Thomas says we won't hurt much. Not like they did. How do we stop it? I asked, ignoring Melissa's incredulous stare. You can't, Robert said simply. Once it starts, there's only one way out. Burn it, June whispered. Burn the house to the ground. We left shortly after, Melissa driving in tense silence. I could feel her anger, her disbelief, radiating from her in waves. You can't possibly believe that nonsense, she finally said as we approached Mrs. Holloway's house to pick up Emma. I don't know what to believe anymore, I admitted. But you have to admit, it explains what I've been experiencing. Jack, they're clearly unwell. Paranoid. Living in some shared delusion. Then how do you explain the dirt in Emma's bed? The bruises on my wrist? I thrust my arm toward her, showing the 5 darkening marks. Something happened last night, Melissa. Something I can't explain. Before she could answer, we pulled up in front of Mrs. Holloway's modest bungalow. The front door opened immediately, and Emma came bounding out, followed more slowly by her elderly neighbor. Something in Mrs. Holloway's expression made my stomach clench. Everything okay? I asked as Emma climbed into the back seat. Mrs. Holloway hesitated, then leaned closer to my window. She's a lovely child, she said quietly. But perhaps you should have her talk to someone. Why? Melissa asked sharply. What happened? She spent most of the morning drawing pictures, Mrs. Holloway replied. Pictures of people, underground. People with no eyes. She said there are friends from the basement. I turned to look at Emma, who smiled back innocently. Did you have a good time, sweetheart? I asked carefully. Yes, Daddy. Thomas came with me. He likes Mrs. Holloway's cookies. The drive home was silent except for Emma's cheerful humming, a melody I didn't recognize, something old and discordant. As we approached our house, its pink exterior gleaming in the afternoon sun, I felt a sense of dread growing within me. Maybe we should stay at a hotel tonight, I suggested as Melissa parked in the driveway. She gave me a long look. Jack, we need to be rational about this. Emma's an imaginative child. The Hendersons are troubled people who filled your head with ghost stories. There's nothing supernatural happening here. Then how do you explain? I don't know, she snapped, then immediately softened her tone. I don't know. But there are rational explanations for everything. There have to be. We went inside, the house welcoming us with its silent, empty rooms. Everything looked normal, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the familiar furniture, the photographs on the walls. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. That night, after Melissa and Emma had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, a cup of cold coffee before me and a decision weighing on my mind. The Hendersons' words echoed in my thoughts. Burn it. Burn the house to the ground. Could I do it? Destroy our home, our investment, our fresh start? Would it even work, or would the entities simply escape, find a new dwelling, continue their cycle? A soft noise from the basement door interrupted my thoughts. It was opening slowly, though no one stood near it. Beyond, darkness beckoned. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I rose and approached. The basement lights wouldn't turn on. They never did at night anymore, I noticed, so I used my phone's flashlight as I descended the creaking stairs. The storage room door stood open, as I somehow knew it would. Inside, the trapdoor had returned, lying open in the center of the dirt floor. The smell that rose from it was different now, not the stench of decay, but something earthy and ancient, almost alluring. "I know you're there," I called softly into the darkness. "I know what you want." Whispers rose from the opening, swirling around me like invisible smoke. I couldn't distinguish words, but the meaning was clear: hunger, need, loneliness. "You can't have my daughter," I said firmly. "You can't have my family." A figure began to emerge from the trapdoor, not the shambling corpse-like apparition from before, but a man in old-fashioned clothing, his face gaunt but human. His eyes, when they fixed on mine, were dark and bottomless. "Everyone serves in their time," he said, his voice surprisingly normal. "The house chooses. The keeper serves. The cycle continues." "Who are you?" I asked, though I suspected I knew. "Elias Keller," he replied with a slight bow. "The first keeper. And you, Professor Langley, may be the last." "I won't do it," I said. "I won't hurt people. I won't feed whatever's down there." Keller smiled sadly. "You misunderstand. We don't want your victims. We want you. Your family. Your essence." He gestured to the trapdoor. "We are hungry, yes, but not for flesh, for life, for connection, for an end to our isolation." Other figures were emerging now, standing behind Keller, men and women in clothing from different eras, all with the same hollow eyes, the same hungry expressions. "Your daughter understands," Keller continued. "Children always do. They see past the horror to the loneliness beneath. She will join us willingly, in time. As will your wife. As will you." "No," I said, backing toward the door. "I'll destroy this house first. Burn it to the ground." Keller's laugh was dry, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Others have tried. The fire never catches. The house protects itself." His expression softened. "It doesn't have to be unpleasant, Professor. Become the keeper. Visit us. Talk to us. Share your life with us. In return, we grant long life, prosperity, knowledge." "At what cost?" I demanded. "Only your soul," Keller replied simply. "And that only at the end of your natural life." I continued backing away, shaking my head. "I won't agree to that. I won't damn my family." "Then we will take what we need," Keller said, his voice hardening. "Starting with the child." As if on cue, I heard Emma's voice from upstairs, a frightened cry quickly muffled. I turned and ran, taking the basement stairs two at a time. Behind me, I heard the whispers growing louder, more insistent, and the sound of many footsteps following. I burst into Emma's bedroom to find her sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide and unfocused. At the foot of her bed stood a boy, perhaps 11 or 12, dressed in clothes from another century, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. Thomas, I breathed. The boy turned to look at me, his eyes like black pits in his face. She's coming with us, he said in a child's voice that echoed strangely. She promised. Emma, sweetheart, I said urgently, moving toward her bed. You need to come with Daddy now. Emma's gaze shifted to me, but there was no recognition in her eyes. I want to play with Thomas, she said in a flat voice. He says there are lots of games underground. You can't go, Emma. Those aren't games. There, I broke off as more figures appeared in the room, shadowy forms materializing from the darkness in the corners. I lunged forward, scooping Emma into my arms. She struggled immediately, her small body thrashing with unnatural strength. I held tight, backing toward the door. Mine, Thomas hissed, his face contorting into something inhuman. The other figures moved closer, their whispers filling the room, their cold hands reaching for us. I ran into the hallway, Emma still struggling in my arms, and burst into our bedroom. Melissa sat up, startled from sleep. Jack? What? We need to leave. Now. I deposited Emma on the bed and began throwing clothes into a bag. Don't ask questions. Just trust me. To my surprise, Melissa didn't argue. Perhaps she saw something in my face, or perhaps she heard the whispers that were growing louder in the hallway outside our room. We dressed quickly, Melissa holding onto Emma, who had gone eerily still. When we opened the bedroom door, the hallway was clear, but the temperature had dropped significantly, our breath fogging in the air. Down the stairs, out the front door, I instructed. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back. We made our way downstairs, the house creaking and shifting around us. The front door seemed to recede as we approached, the hallway stretching impossibly. Behind us, shadows gathered, whispers echoed. Jack, Melissa whispered, clutching Emma tighter. What's happening to the house? The walls were changing, the cheerful wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark stains beneath, the floors warping and cracking. The pleasant pink Victorian was revealing its true nature. We reached the front door, and I grabbed the handle, only to find it ice cold and immovable. Locked. I tried the windows next, but they too refused to budge. Back door, I said, leading them through the increasingly distorted interior. The kitchen floor tilted beneath our feet, the ceiling sagging downward. The back door opened with surprising ease, too much ease. I hesitated, suspecting a trap, but we had no choice. We stepped outside into the cool night air, relief washing over me as we crossed the threshold. But the yard beyond wasn't our yard. The grass was overgrown, waist-high and gray in the moonlight. The neighboring houses were gone, replaced by endless empty fields stretching to a horizon that seemed too close, too curt. We're still in the house, Melissa realized, her voice breaking. It's showing us. I don't know what this is. Emma stirred in her arms, her eyes opening. But they weren't Emma's eyes anymore. They were black, bottomless, like Thomas's had been. Home, she said in a voice that wasn't hers. We're all home now. The ground beneath our feet began to crumble, the grass withering away to reveal dark soil that shifted and sank. We were being pulled down, the earth swallowing us inch by inch. No! I shouted, grabbing Melissa and Emma, trying to pull them free. We're not yours. We refuse. Laughter surrounded us, Keller's dry chuckle, Thomas's childish giggle, and others, dozens of others. The pink house stood before us, no longer pretending to be anything but what it was, a prison, a trap, a feeding ground. As the earth claimed us, as darkness rose to engulf us, I made one last desperate attempt. Not to escape, I knew now that was impossible, but to break the cycle. We accept. I shouted into the void. We accept being keepers. All of us, me, Melissa, Emma, will tend the house. We'll remember you. We'll speak to you. But we stay together as a family, and we stay alive. The darkness hesitated, the pulling sensation eased. I felt cold breath against my ear as Keller whispered, "Accepted. The family keeps the house. The house keeps the family." The world shifted, tilted, rearranged itself. Suddenly we were standing in our living room, our normal, undistorted living room. Everything looked as it should, except for the thin layer of dirt that covered the floor. Melissa stood beside me, her expression dazed. Emma was between us, holding our hands, looking like herself again, except for a strange, knowing light in her eyes. "What did you do?" Melissa whispered. "What agreement did you make?" "The only one I could," I replied. "We stay together. We stay alive. And in return, we remember them," Emma finished, her voice childlike yet somehow ancient. "We talk to them. We keep them company." She smiled up at us. "They're not so bad when you get to know them. They're just lonely." From the basement came the soft sound of whispers, not threatening now, but welcoming. Grateful. The pink house had found its new keepers. And we had found our place within its walls, not as victims, but as caretakers of the forgotten, the lost, the hungry dead beneath the cheerful exterior. As dawn broke, casting golden light through our windows, I knew our lives had changed forever. We were bound to this place now, to its secrets and its horrors. But we were together. We were alive. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the whispers from below grew soft and almost musical, I could almost convince myself that was enough. What would you do if you saw someone who's been dead for 30 years? The question hung in the air of our small meeting room at the Oak Ridge Senior Community Center. 6 pairs of eyes blinked back at me, some amused, others curious. This was how we started every Sunday meeting of what we jokingly called the Sunday Investigators Club, with a question that challenged our rational minds. I'm Eleanor Wright, 73 years young, former high school librarian, and now the unofficial leader of our little group. We're just a bunch of retirees in the quiet town of Pinecrest, North Carolina, who found each other through a shared fascination with local mysteries and legends. "Well, I'd probably check my medication first," quipped Arthur, our resident skeptic and retired physics professor. His bushy white eyebrows danced above horn-rimmed glasses as the group chuckled. "I'd ask them why they'd come back," said gentle-voiced Martha, who always saw the human element in our supernatural discussions. At 78, she was our oldest member, with a lifetime of nursing experience that made her both compassionate and pragmatic. The others, Henry the ex-banker, twins Robert and Richard who'd run the local hardware store for 40 years, and Dorothy the former newspaper editor, all offered their thoughts. It was our ritual, this exchange of hypotheticals before diving into the case of the week. Today's discussion was meant to be about the Blackwater Creek disappearances of 1976, but Henry shuffled in 15 minutes late, clutching a dusty ledger to his chest, his typically composed demeanor visibly shaken. "I found something," he announced, interrupting Dorothy mid-sentence. "About the Willow Creek mine." The room fell silent. The abandoned coal mine had been closed since a tragedy in 1952, when 3 miners disappeared during a routine shift. According to local lore, their bodies were never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The mine had been sealed ever since, deemed too unstable for further exploration. It's been right under our noses all this time, Henry continued, laying the ledger on our central table. I was going through my father's papers, he was the bank manager back then, and found this. It's the financial records of Willow Creek Mining Company. We gathered around as Henry pointed to suspicious entries dating just before the incident. Large sums transferred to unnamed accounts, equipment purchases that made no sense for a coal operation, and a series of notes about something called Project Echo. This doesn't look like standard mining business, Dorothy said, her journalist instincts kicking in. It looks like they were funding something else entirely. Exactly, Henry nodded. And look at this. He flipped to a page where a small newspaper clipping had been tucked. The headline read, Unusual seismic activity recorded near Willow Creek. The article, dated just 1 week before the miners vanished, briefly mentioned that local residents had reported strange vibrations and sounds coming from the direction of the mine, like the earth itself was humming. I think they found something down there, Henry said, his voice lowering involuntarily. Something they weren't supposed to find. As the winter sun began to set outside our windows, casting long shadows across the room, we made a unanimous decision that would later seem both foolish and inevitable. We would investigate the Willow Creek mine. Over the following week, we gathered what information we could. Dorothy used her old newspaper connections to access archives, finding a series of peculiar incidents around the time of the disappearances, electrical disturbances, unexplained lights in the sky, and several reports of missing pets in neighboring areas. Robert and Richard, with their practical knowledge, obtained old structural plans of the mine. Martha researched the missing miners' medical records, discovering that all three had visited the doctor with complaints of headaches and insomnia in the weeks before they vanished. Arthur, our skeptic, reluctantly agreed to join our expedition but insisted on bringing scientific equipment, an electromagnetic field detector, temperature sensors, and audio recording devices. Not because I believe in ghosts, he assured us, but to document natural explanations for phenomena. The day we chose for our expedition was unseasonably warm for February, the kind of false spring that fools the dogwoods into early bloom. We met at the community center parking lot, our modest convoy consisting of Arthur's aging Volvo and Richard's pickup truck. Each of us carried a backpack with water, snacks, first aid supplies, and flashlights with extra batteries. The drive to Willow Creek took nearly 40 minutes, the last 15 on an overgrown fire road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. As we approached, I felt a strange tightness in my chest, not my heart acting up, but something else, like pressure from the outside pushing inward. Anyone else feel that? I asked as we stepped out of our vehicles. Martha nodded. Barometric pressure must be changing. Storm coming maybe. But the sky above was clear blue, without a cloud in sight. The mine entrance was as depressing as one might expect after 70 years of abandonment, a dark maw in the hillside, partially collapsed and officially sealed with concrete barriers and warning signs. However, Robert quickly discovered what locals had apparently known for years, a secondary entrance via an old ventilation shaft about 100 yards east of the main one. Kids had been coming here for decades, he explained, showing us where the boards covering the shaft had been repeatedly removed and replaced. Beer cans and graffiti inside prove it. This is extremely inadvisable, Arthur complained, but he was already setting up his equipment. The structural integrity of these passages cannot be guaranteed. We're not going deep, I assure everyone. Just a preliminary exploration today. We stay together, we mark our path, and we lead at the first sign of danger. How hollow those words would sound just hours later. The shaft entrance was tight but manageable, a sloped tunnel reinforced with rotting timber that led down into darkness. One by one, we switched on our flashlights and descended, the beams cutting through dense shadows to reveal a narrow passage ahead. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a mineral smell that was to be expected, but beneath it was something else, a faint metallic tang that reminded me oddly of blood. The walls were damp, occasionally glittering where our lights caught deposits of some crystalline substance. "That's unusual," Arthur murmured, pausing to examine one such patch. "This doesn't look like any mineral formation I've seen in coal mines." "Is it valuable?" Dorothy asked. "I don't know what it is," he admitted, scraping a small sample into a plastic bag. "But it's giving off slightly elevated electromagnetic readings." We continued deeper, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. Unlike what one might expect from an abandoned space, there was a distinct absence of the usual signs of nature reclaiming territory. No insects, no small animals, not even the sound of water dripping that one would associate with underground spaces. The main tunnel eventually opened into what had been a hub area, with equipment left to rust and several smaller tunnels branching off. The ceiling was higher here, allowing us to stand upright. Robert consulted the mind map spread on a collapsed wooden table. According to this, the accident happened in the northeast section. He pointed to an area marked with a faded red X. "That's down that passageway." As we collectively turned our flashlights toward the indicated tunnel, I noticed something strange about the shadows they cast. They seemed to move a fraction of a second after our lights did, as if reluctant to follow their natural physics. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Martha, who stood beside me. "See what?" she asked, but her attention was already drawn elsewhere. "Do you hear that?" At first, I heard nothing, but then it came, a low humming vibration, more felt than heard, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. Arthur's EMF meter suddenly spiked, its digital display flickering wildly before going dark. "Battery failure," he announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "Probably the dampness affecting the circuits." "Mine's still working," Dorothy said, holding up her flashlight. We stood in hesitant silence, each of us sensing that unseen boundary that separates curiosity from foolhardiness. Then Henry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout our exploration, stepped decisively toward the northeast tunnel. "We came for answers," he said simply. "Let's find them." The tunnel narrowed as we proceeded, forcing us to walk single file. I took the lead, with Martha behind me, followed by the twins, Dorothy, Henry, and Arthur bringing up the rear. The humming grew more pronounced, transitioning from something felt into something unquestionably audible. "This isn't mechanical," Arthur called from behind. "The frequency is inconsistent. Natural phenomenon, perhaps air moving through the rock formations." None of us were convinced by his explanation, but it was comforting nonetheless to hear him try to rationalize it. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, but unlike the hub area, this one showed signs of deliberate excavation beyond coal mining. The walls were smoother, almost polished in places, and at the center of the room stood what appeared to be the remains of some kind of equipment, not mining machinery, but something more sophisticated, with components that reminded me vaguely of early computers. "This wasn't on the map," Robert said, confusion evident in his voice. "Project Echo," Henry breathed, moving toward the equipment. "This must be it." As Henry approached the mysterious apparatus, I noticed something odd about the floor, thin lines etched into the rock in concentric circles, emanating outward from where the equipment stood. They reminded me of circuit boards somehow, though that made no sense in this context. "Don't touch anything," I cautioned, but my warning came too late. Henry had already placed his hand on what appeared to be a control panel, brushing away decades of dust. Nothing happened for a moment, and he looked back at us with a sheepish smile. Then the humming stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. It was as though the mine itself had been holding its breath and had now made a decision. "We should leave," Martha said, voicing what we were all thinking. Before anyone could move, a new sound emerged, a soft clicking that seemed to come from all directions at once. Our flashlights began to flicker, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that our breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "Everyone stay calm," I said, but my own heart was racing. "Let's head back, together, now." We turned toward the tunnel entrance, but in the unstable light of our flashlights, it seemed to have moved, or perhaps it was our own disorientation in the darkness. A gust of wind came from nowhere, carrying with it a whisper of voices too faint to understand but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" Dorothy gasped. "Someone's down here with us." "It's just the wind," Arthur insisted, though his scientific certainty had abandoned him. Then Martha screamed, a sound so unlike her usual gentle demeanor that we all froze in shock. She was pointing toward the far corner of the chamber, where our wavering flashlights revealed what appeared to be a human figure, motionless and observing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond or move, but as we all directed our lights toward it, I could make out the outline of what appeared to be a man in old-fashioned work clothes, the kind a miner in the 1950s might have worn. His face was obscured by shadow, but there was something unsettling about his posture, too still, too patient. Henry took a step toward the figure. "Hello? Do you need help?" "Henry, don't," Martha warned, but he continued forward. As he approached, the figure remained motionless until Henry was perhaps 10 feet away. Then, with a movement too quick to follow, it was suddenly beside him. Henry gasped, stumbling backward, but the figure reached out and gripped his arm. In the crossing beams of our flashlights, I caught a glimpse of the figure's face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been was only smooth, dark stone, like coal polish to a mirror finish. Henry didn't scream. He simply went rigid, his eyes widening in what could only be described as recognition rather than fear. The figure's grip on his arm seemed to change, not holding him but melding with him, as though the darkness of its substance was flowing into Henry's skin. "Run!" Richard shouted, breaking our collective paralysis. What followed was chaos. Our light beams swung wildly as we scrambled back toward the tunnel. I heard Robert fall, the thud of his body against stone followed by a cry of pain. Dorothy was helping him up while Richard grabbed Martha's hand, pulling her along. Arthur and I reached the tunnel entrance first, turning to make sure the others were following. In the frantic illumination of our flashlights, I saw Henry still standing by the strange figure, utterly motionless now, his face a mask of tranquil awareness that was somehow more frightening than terror would have been. "Henry!" I called out. "Come on!" He turned toward us slowly, and when he spoke, his voice had a subtle echo to it, as though coming from somewhere much deeper than his throat. "It's all right, Eleanor," he said. "I understand now. They've been waiting for someone to hear them." "Who's been waiting?" Arthur demanded, his scientific mind still grasping for comprehension. Henry smiled, a serene expression that belonged on a saint's face, not a frightened senior citizen in an abandoned mine. "The ones who've always been here, long before the miners came. The ones who sing in the dark." As he spoke, the humming returned, louder now, resolving into something almost musical, a chorus of tones that seemed to resonate not just in our ears, but in our bones and teeth. "Henry, please," Martha pleaded. "Let's go." He shook his head gently. "You go ahead. I need to stay a while longer. There's so much to learn." The figure beside Henry seemed to ripple, and suddenly there were more of them, shadowy forms emerging from the walls themselves, each with that same featureless face of polished stone. "Run!" I screamed, all pretense of calm leadership abandoned. We fled up the tunnel, the strange music pursuing us like a physical force. Richard tripped, falling hard, and when Dorothy tried to help him up, she cried out in horror. "Something's got my ankle." In the bobbing light of my flashlight, I saw dark tendrils, like liquid shadow, wrapping around her leg from a crack in the floor. Arthur, showing surprising strength for his age, grabbed Dorothy under the arms and pulled. The shadow substance stretched like taffy but wouldn't release her. Martha frantically dug through her bag and produced a small pocket knife, which she used to slash at the dark material. To our astonishment, the substance recoiled as if in pain, releasing Dorothy's ankle with a sound like a sigh. We didn't wait to see what would happen next, hauling Dorothy to her feet and continuing our desperate escape. Behind us, Henry's voice echoed one last time through the tunnel, "Don't worry about me. I'll be right here when you want to learn more." We emerged into the fading daylight, gasping and trembling. Only then did we realize that Robert was missing. "He was right behind me," Richard said, his face ashen. "I swear he was right behind me." We called his name from the entrance, our voices echoing down into the darkness. There was no response except, perhaps, the faintest echo of that strange humming music. As twilight descended, we were forced to make the hardest decision of our lives, to leave, to get help, knowing that returning with authorities would likely be too late for Henry and Robert if it wasn't already. The drive back to town was silent except for Martha's quiet sobbing. Dorothy's ankle was discolored where the shadow had gripped her, a bruise-like marking in a pattern none of us could identify. We reported everything to the local sheriff, who organized a search party for the following morning. When they explored the mine, they found no sign of Henry or Robert, nor any evidence of the strange equipment we had described. The tunnel to the northeast chamber appeared to have collapsed recently, blocking access entirely. "Probably just got lost and confused in the dark," the sheriff suggested kindly, though his eyes held doubt. "Happens to the best of us, especially at your age." No offense. We knew what we had seen, but without evidence, our story sounded like the confused ramblings of seniors with overactive imaginations. The search was called off after 3 days. A week later, Dorothy noticed that the strange bruise on her ankle had begun to spread, tracing patterns under her skin that resembled the circuit-like markings we had seen on the chamber floor. And each night since our expedition, all of us who returned have reported the same dream of Henry and Robert standing together in that underground chamber, surrounded by the faceless figures, smiling serenely as they beckon us to join them. The Sunday Investigators Club still meets each week, but now with only 5 members instead of 7. We no longer discuss local legends or historical mysteries. Now we have only one case: to understand what happened to our friends, what lies beneath Willow Creek Mine, and why, when we turn out the lights at night, we can still hear that humming music, growing louder with each passing day. Has anyone else been hearing it at home? The question hung in our suddenly silent meeting room. It had been 3 weeks since our disastrous expedition to Willow Creek Mine, and this was the first time any of us had directly acknowledged the strange phenomena that had followed us back. Dorothy was the one who asked. Her ankle, where the shadow-like substance had gripped her, now displayed an intricate pattern of dark lines that resembled circuit pathways. She kept it covered with long pants, but we all knew it was spreading, climbing slowly up her calf like a parasitic vine. The humming, Arthur confirmed, his scientific skepticism finally crumbling. At night, just before sleep, like it's coming through the walls. We all nodded. Martha's hands trembled as she poured her tea, spilling droplets onto the community center table. Richard's face had aged a decade in these weeks, the absence of his twin brother leaving him looking perpetually incomplete. "I think I saw Robert last night," Richard said quietly. "In my bathroom mirror. He was standing behind me, but when I turned around, he didn't need to finish." We understood. As for me, I'd been experiencing something perhaps more disturbing, moments of clarity about the mind, flashes of knowledge I couldn't possibly possess. I knew the exact depth of the northeast chamber, 412 feet below surface level. I knew the composition of the strange crystalline formations, not of this earth. And sometimes, in dreams, I could hear Henry's voice explaining things to me in scientific terms I didn't understand. "We need to go back," I said, the words escaping before I could reconsider them. "Have you lost your mind?" Arthur's voice cracked with uncharacteristic emotion. "Two of us are already gone." "And they're still there," I insisted. "Something in that mind, it's connected to us now. Running away won't help." "Eleanor's right," Dorothy said, rolling up her pant leg to reveal the circuit-like pattern that now reached her knee. "This isn't stopping. And I've been hearing things. Voices. Instructions." "Instructions for what?" Martha asked, though her expression suggested she already feared the answer. Dorothy hesitated. "For building something. I've been drawing diagrams in my sleep." She reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook filled with pages of technical schematics that looked vaguely like the equipment we had seen in the mine, but more advanced somehow. "This is insanity," Arthur muttered, but he leaned forward to examine the drawings with the intense focus of his academic background. "These components, some of them haven't been invented yet. Or shouldn't have been in the 1950s. "It's not from the 1950s, I said with sudden certainty. "That mine was just an access point. What's down there is much older." My four remaining friends stared at me, and I recognized the same unspoken question in all their eyes. "How do you know this?" The truth was, I didn't know how I knew. The information simply existed in my mind now, as if it had always been there, waiting to be accessed. Like an external hard drive suddenly plugged into my consciousness. "We need help," Martha suggested. "Professional help. Maybe a paranormal research team or—" "No," Richard interrupted with unexpected firmness. "No outsiders. They took my brother. Whatever this is, it's between us and them now." The word then sent a collective shiver through our group. None of us had yet defined exactly what we thought the entities in the mine were. Ghosts? Aliens? Some unknown natural phenomenon? The lack of definition made them more terrifying, yet also left room for hope that their intentions might not be malevolent. "I've been doing research," Arthur said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Into Project Echo. It wasn't easy. Most records have been expunged or classified, but I found mentions in some declassified military documents from the Cold War era." We listened intently as he explained that Project Echo had apparently been a government initiative investigating unusual properties of certain underground locations. The project was officially about acoustic properties for communication purposes, but reading between the lines, Arthur suspected they had discovered something unexpected at Willow Creek. The project was suddenly shut down in 1952, all personnel reassigned, and the record sealed. That matches the timeline of the mining accident. So the government knew what was down there, Dorothy concluded. And they just sealed it up and walked away, I added, another piece of knowledge surfacing from that strange new part of my mind. But they couldn't contain it completely. It's been leaking for decades. Richard stood up abruptly. I'm going back tomorrow. With or without you. Robert is down there. We go together or not at all, I said, surprised by my own authority. And we need to prepare better this time. Over the next 2 days, we gathered supplies with grim determination. Arthur brought more sophisticated equipment, professional-grade EMF detectors, a thermal imaging camera borrowed from a former colleague, and recording devices. Martha, drawing on her nursing background, assembled an enhanced first aid kit. Dorothy, following the strange instructions in her sleep drawings, constructed a small device from parts cannibalized from household electronics. I don't know what it does, she admitted as we examined the palm-sized object with its intricate arrangement of circuits. But I know we need it. Richard brought weapons, his hunting rifle and 2 handguns. When Martha protested, he simply said, better to have them and not need them. As for me, I brought something I couldn't explain even to myself, a small pouch of soil from my garden mixed with iron filings and salt. The knowledge of its necessity had come to me in dreams, whispered by a voice that sounded like Henry's but wasn't quite human anymore. We chose a Tuesday morning for our return, when the community center would not miss our regular presence and no one would expect to hear from us until the weekly card game on Thursday. Enough time to find answers, or to become another mysterious disappearance in Pinecrest's growing collection. The drive to Willow Creek seemed shorter this time, the landscape flying by in a blur of late winter forests. None of us spoke much, each lost in our own thoughts or perhaps listening to the humming that had become a constant companion. It was louder now as we approached the mine, vibrating through the car chassis like a living thing eager for our return. The mine entrance looked different, the boards over the ventilation shaft were gone completely, and the opening seemed wider, more welcoming. The air around it shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, though the February morning was cold enough to show our breath. It's changing, Arthur murmured, his scientific mind still trying to categorize the impossible. Adapting. It's been waiting for us, I corrected, again with that unsettling certainty. We equipped ourselves methodically, headlamps this time instead of flashlights, backpacks with supplies, Dorothy's mysterious device clipped to her belt. Richard checked his weapons, and I clutched my pouch of soil mixture, feeling both foolish and reassured by its weight. The descent felt familiar, like returning to a place we had visited many times, but we had been there only once. The tunnel was definitely wider now, the ceiling higher, the walls smoother. The crystalline formations were more prominent, pulsing faintly with an inner light that cast no shadows. The structure has changed, Arthur confirmed, consulting the mind map. This tunnel has been remodeled. Not by human hands, Martha whispered. The humming grew louder as we approached the hub area, resolving into distinct tones that seemed almost like speech just below the threshold of comprehension. Dorothy's device began to emit a soft blue light, pulsing in rhythm with the sounds. The hub area had transformed completely. Where there had been a collapsed table and rusting equipment, there was now a perfectly circular chamber with 7 stone seats arranged in a ring. The walls glittered with the crystalline formations, now clearly growing in patterns too regular to be natural. 7 seats, Richard noted, his voice tight with emotion. They knew we would come back. All of us, Martha added, looking at the two empty seats that seemed to wait for Henry and Robert. As if summoned by our thoughts, a figure stepped from one of the branching tunnels. Robert, or something wearing Robert's appearance. His skin had a slight sheen to it, like polished stone, and his movements were too fluid, too precise. Richard made a choked sound and started forward, but I grabbed his arm. Wait. Not Robert smiled, the expression uncanny in its perfection. You've returned, he said, his voice overlaid with that same humming tone. Good. There is much to share. Where's my brother? Richard demanded. The real Robert. Not Robert tilted his head in confusion. I am Robert. Just more than I was before. As Henry is more now. On cue, Henry, or the entity that had been Henry, emerged from another tunnel. He looked much like not Robert, with that same stone-like quality to his skin, the same two perfect movements. Eleanor, not Henry, greeted me warmly. You felt it, haven't you? The knowledge flowing into you. The connection. I couldn't deny it. What are you? What happened to our friends? We are the echoes, not Henry explained, gesturing to the walls around us. We have existed in this place since before your kind walked upright. We were sleeping until humans broke into our chamber in 1952. The missing miners, Arthur breathed. Not Henry nodded. The first to join us. There have been others since, curious teens, lost hikers. But none with minds as receptive as yours. None who came seeking understanding rather than thrills. You've been influencing us, Dorothy accused, touching her ankle with a circuit pattern continued to spread. Changing us. Connecting with you, not Robert corrected. What you see as infection is communication. A bridge between your consciousness and ours. Martha, who had been silent, suddenly gasped and pointed to the ceiling. We looked up to see what appeared to be a night sky, but we were underground, a vast field of stars in impossible configurations, swirling in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. This is where we came from, not Henry explained. A place beyond your understanding, for now. We were explorers, like you. We came to study this world when it was young. When something went wrong with our vehicle, we became trapped, our consciousness embedded in the crystalline structures of this place. You're aliens? Arthur asked, his scientific mind finally finding a category that fit. Not Henry smiled indulgently. That word is insufficient, but close enough. We have been trying to rebuild our technology to return home, or at least to communicate with our kind. The humans who discovered us in the 50s realized our potential and tried to weaponize us. Project Echo, I said. Yes. When we resisted, they sealed the mine and buried the evidence. But we continued our work, slowly adapting this environment and occasionally finding receptive minds to help us. And now you are our help, Dorothy concluded, looking down at her device which was pulsing more rapidly now. We want to offer you a trade, not Robert said. Help us complete our communication array, and we will share knowledge beyond anything your species currently possesses. What happens to Robert and Henry? Richard demanded. Their real selves? The two entities exchanged glances. They are here, within us, not Henry said carefully. Their consciousness merged with ours. It was their choice. Bullshit, Richard spat, his hand moving toward his gun. It's true, not Robert said, and for a moment, something genuinely like Robert flickered in his expression, a hint of the man we had known. Rich, it's me, I promise. I'm still here, just expanded. I understand things now. Amazing things. Martha stepped forward, her medical instincts overcoming her fear. Are they in pain? No pain, not Henry assured her. Only wonder. Dorothy's device suddenly emitted a high-pitched tone, and she looked down at it in surprise. It's ready, she said, though it wasn't clear if she was speaking to us or to something inside her own mind. Yes, Na Henry confirmed. The receiver is calibrated. Now we need the transmitter. He gestured toward the northeast tunnel, the one that had supposedly collapsed. Will you help us? One final expedition together? We looked at each other, a silent communication passing between us. What choice did we really have? Whatever was happening to Dorothy was already spreading to the rest of us. I could feel the knowledge continuing to flow into my mind, alien concepts taking root alongside my human thoughts. We'll see the transmitter, I decided, speaking for the group as I often did. Then we decide. Not Henry and not Robert seemed pleased with this compromise. They led us down the northeastern tunnel, which now resembled a perfectly cylindrical tube, its walls lined with the glowing crystalline formations arranged in complex patterns. These are memory crystals, Na Henry explained as we walked. They contain our history, our knowledge, and the blueprints for the technology we need to build. They're also what's changing you, not Robert added. The patterns you're seeing on Dorothy's skin are a physical manifestation of the data transfer. Your minds are being prepared to understand our science. Without our consent, Arthur pointed out coldly. Your curiosity was consent, Na Henry replied. You came seeking mysteries. We are simply answering your questions in the only way possible, by expanding your capacity to understand the answers. The tunnel descended deeper than should have been possible given the area's geography. After what felt like 20 minutes of walking, we emerged into a vast cavern that defied all logic and expectations. The space was enormous, at least the size of a football stadium, with a domed ceiling covered in the same star-like lights we had seen earlier. The floor was a complex arrangement of concentric circles, identical to the patterns spreading across Dorothy's skin. At the center stood a partially constructed structure that resembled nothing so much as a massive antenna or satellite dish, though made of materials that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Our transmitter, Na Henry announced with evident pride. Nearly complete after 70 years of work. What will it do? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the knowledge seeping into my mind. It will send a signal to our home, not Robert explained. Not just a message, a complete transfer of our consciousness. We can finally go home. And what happens to this place when you're gone? Arthur asked, ever the practical thinker. To the people you've merged with? The entities exchanged another look. That is part of our offer, Na Henry said carefully. Those who help us can choose, remain here with the expanded knowledge we've given you, or come with us. Come with you? Martha echoed. How? The consciousness transfer works both ways, not Robert explained. Your minds could join ours in the signal. Leaving our bodies behind, I concluded, understanding the implicit horror of what was being suggested. Empty vessels, Na Henry confirmed. Though with the knowledge we've given you, you could potentially build new bodies, better ones. Or exist without physical form entirely. Richard's hand had never left his gun. Now he drew it, pointing it at not Robert. Give me back my brother. Now. Not Robert sighed, a too perfect replication of human sadness. It doesn't work that way, Rich. The merger is permanent. But you could join us. We could be together again. Stop it. Richard's voice broke. Stop wearing his face if he's gone. He's not gone, not Henry insisted. He's here. We're all here together. Dorothy's device suddenly flared with blue light, and she gasped, doubling over. When she straightened, her eyes had changed, the irises now containing the same circuit-like patterns that covered her leg. I can see it now, she whispered. The whole design. It's beautiful. Martha moved to her side. Dorothy? Are you okay? Better than okay, she replied, her voice taking on that same humming quality that characterized the entities. I understand now. I can see what they're building. It's not just a way home for them, it's a gateway. A connection between worlds. Arthur adjusted his glasses nervously. She's being influenced. We need to get her out of here. It's too late for that, I said, that alien certainty flowing through me again. It's too late for all of us. I could feel it now, the knowledge expanding beyond facts and figures into something more fundamental. My perception was changing, the very way I process reality shifting to accommodate concepts that human minds were never designed to hold. Na Henry approached me, extending a hand that shimmered slightly, as if not quite solid. You feel it the strongest, Eleanor. You've always been the most receptive among your friends. The leader. The one who seeks understanding above all else. I stepped back, clutching my pouch of soil mixture. The knowledge that had led me to create it now surfaced fully in my mind. This isn't just about going home for you, is it? I challenged. You're not just trapped travelers. Na Henry's perfect smile faltered slightly. What do you mean? You're scouts, I said, the revelation coming to me as I spoke it. The first wave. You want to open a doorway for others to follow. A ripple of something, surprise? Concern passed between Na Henry and not Robert. Dorothy moved to stand beside them, her eyes now glowing faintly with the same light as the crystals. It would be a mutual exchange, Na Henry said carefully. Your kind would benefit enormously from the knowledge. No, I interrupted. You're not being honest with us. I can see it now. The transmitter isn't just for communication. It's a beacon. A doorway. Martha and Arthur looked at me with confusion, but Richard nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. That's why the government sealed this place, he said. They realize what you really are. Not Robert's expression hardened, becoming less human by the second. What we are is more evolved than you can comprehend. We offer transcendence beyond your limited existence. At the cost of our humanity, I countered. A small price for immortality, Dorothy said, her voice now almost indistinguishable from the entities. They've shown me what's possible. We could leave these failing bodies behind. Martha reached for her hand. Dorothy, this isn't you talking. Dorothy pulled away. It is me. Just more. I'm sorry you can't understand yet. She moved to stand fully with the entities, the circuit patterns now visibly spreading up her neck toward her face. Na Henry sighed. We had hoped for voluntary cooperation from all of you. It would make the transition easier. But even partial assistance will suffice. You're not taking anyone else, Richard growled, raising his gun again. Not Robert made a dismissive gesture, and the weapon flew from Richard's hand, disassembling in midair, its components clattering to the ground. Your primitive tools cannot harm us, Na Henry said. though we have no desire to harm you either. You will simply help us complete our work, whether consciously or not." As he spoke, I felt a pressure building in my mind, alien thoughts pushing against my own, seeking entry. From the pained expressions on Martha's and Richard's faces, they felt it too. Arthur had dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The knowledge that had guided me suddenly crystallized into purpose. I opened my pouch and grabbed a handful of the mixture inside. "Iron and salt," I said. "Elements your kind can't process easily. They disrupt your crystalline structure." I threw the mixture at the nearest wall of memory crystals. Where the particles landed, the crystals dimmed, their glow faltering. Na Henry made a sound, not quite human, not quite machine, a discordant note that echoed through the chamber. "Stop!" Dorothy cried, but I was already moving, scattering the mixture in a circle around us. "The iron disrupts their electromagnetic field," I explained to my friends as I worked. "The salt absorbs and grounds their energy. The soil provides a barrier of organic material they can't easily penetrate." "How do you know this?" Martha asked, helping me complete the circle. "They told me," I said grimly. "Not intentionally. But when they started feeding information into my mind, they couldn't control exactly what I received. I saw their weaknesses along with their strengths. Not Henry and not Robert remained outside our circle, their forms seeming less solid now, flickering at the edges like bad television reception. "This is only temporary," Not Henry warned. "You cannot leave this place now. The connection has gone too far." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But we're not helping you open a doorway for invasion either." Dorothy remained with the entities, watching us with disappointment. "You don't understand what you're rejecting," she said. "The beauty of it. The potential." "What we understand," Arthur said, finding his voice again, "is that we're being colonized. Our minds, our bodies, our world." I looked at Dorothy, seeing my friend still present somewhere behind those altered eyes. "We're not leaving without you." "I'm not leaving at all," she replied. "I've made my choice." "Then we respect it," I said, though the words felt like broken glass in my throat. "But we've made ours as well." Martha, who had been examining the scattered components of Richard's gun, suddenly straightened. "I think I know how to stop them. At least long enough for us to escape." She pointed to the transmitter at the center of the cavern. "That's the key, isn't it? If we damage it enough, they'll be set back years." Not Henry's form flickered more violently. "You would not dare. The knowledge, everything we've shared, you would lose it all." It was a desperate bluff. I could feel that the knowledge they had given us was already permanent, integrated into our minds whether we wanted it or not. "Richard," I said quietly, "your other weapons?" He nodded, slowly removing the handguns from his jacket. Not Robert gestured again, but this time the circle of soil mixture seemed to shield us from whatever force he was trying to use. "You cannot stop evolution," Dorothy said, a note of sadness in her altered voice. "It's the natural progression. The merging of consciousness with technology. Maybe someday," I agreed. "But on our terms. Not as an invasion." Richard handed one gun to Arthur and kept the other. They aimed at the central apparatus of the transmitter, where a core of writhing energy pulsed between crystalline structures. Not Henry and not Robert moved toward Dorothy, placing their hands on her shoulders. "If you destroy it, you destroy part of her too," Not Henry warned. "She is connected to it now." I looked at Dorothy, my friend of nearly 20 years. The circuit patterns had reached her temples now, thin lines of dark material tracing across her skin like technological veins. "Dorothy," I said softly, "is that true?" She hesitated, something of her old self flickering across her face. "I don't know. I'm changing, Eleanor. Becoming something neither human nor them. Something new." "Don't do this," not Robert pleaded, and for a moment I could almost believe it was truly Robert speaking. "We can coexist. Share knowledge. Evolve together." Martha took my hand. "Whatever we decide together." That was always our pact in the Investigators Club. I looked at my remaining friends, Arthur with his scientist's mind now balanced between skepticism and wonder, Richard with his grief and determination, Martha with her compassion and pragmatism. And Dorothy, caught between worlds, her transformation already too far advanced to fully reverse. The knowledge the entities had placed in my mind offered a third option, neither destruction nor surrender. "The transmitter can be modified," I said slowly. "Recalibrated to send a message rather than open a doorway." Dorothy's eyes widened with understanding. "A compromise." Not Henry and not Robert exchanged looks that conveyed volumes of alien communication. "What sort of message?" Not Henry finally asked. "The truth," I said. "That Earth is inhabited by sentient beings who wish to establish peaceful contact on equal terms. Not colonization. Not invasion. An honest exchange between different forms of life. And you would help us send this message?" Not Robert asked cautiously. "Yes," I said. "But Dorothy comes back with us. You don't get to keep her, or anyone else." "I'm not sure I can come back," Dorothy said softly. "Not completely." "Then we'll help you find a balance," Martha promised, "between what you were and what you're becoming." The entities conferred silently again, their forms rippling with what might have been debate or calculation. "We accept your terms," Not Henry finally said. "Help us recalibrate the transmitter, and we will release Dorothy to find her own path." "And Robert and Henry?" Richard demanded. Not Robert's form seemed to sigh. "We cannot fully separate from them now. But we can return portions of their consciousness to independent form. Echoes of who they were. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A compromise that might allow us all to survive with some measure of autonomy." Over the next hours, or perhaps it was days, time felt fluid in that place, we worked together to modify the transmitter. Dorothy guided us with her hybrid understanding, translating between human and alien concepts. My own knowledge continued to expand, but I maintained a core of myself that remained defiantly human, a center that could not be colonized. When the work was complete, the transmitter hummed with a different tone, not the invasive, consuming frequency of before, but something clearer, more defined. A question rather than a demand. Not Henry and not Robert gathered with us around the modified device. "It is ready," Not Henry said. "When activated, it will send our message across vast distances to our home world. A request for contact rather than retrieval. And a warning," I added. "That Earth must be approached with respect for its autonomy." Dorothy stood at the activation controls, her appearance now stabilized, changed, certainly, with those circuit patterns faintly visible beneath her skin, but recognizably herself again. The entities had kept their word, allowing her consciousness to reestablish boundaries. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked me quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're doing it our way, not theirs." and that has to count for something. She nodded and pressed the sequence of controls that sent our message hurtling into the depths of space. The transmitter flared with brilliant blue-white light, then settled into a steady glow. "It is done," Na Henry announced. "The message will reach our world in approximately 23 of your years." "What happens now?" Arthur asked. "We wait," not Robert said simply. "And we continue to exist. Apart, but connected." As promised, they helped us locate what remained of Robert and Henry, partial consciousnesses that manifested as shimmering echoes of our friends, incomplete but recognizable. Richard wept when a shade of his brother spoke his name, remembering their shared childhood. When we finally emerged from the mine, blinking in the harsh sunlight of what turned out to be a week later, we were changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. Dorothy's transformation was the most visible, but each of us carried the echoes of alien knowledge inside us, knowledge that would occasionally surface in dreams or moments of insight. The Willow Creek mine remained active with the entity's presence, but we established boundaries, both physical and metaphysical. They would not seek to expand beyond their underground domain, and we would not attempt to destroy them. An uneasy truce between different forms of consciousness sharing one small corner of a much larger universe. The Sunday Investigators Club continued to meet each week, though our investigations took on a different character, less focused on solving mysteries and more on understanding the one we had become part of. Sometimes, translucent forms that resembled Henry and Robert would join us, offering perspectives that spanned human and alien understanding. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, we would all hear the humming, now transformed into something almost like music. A reminder of the vast mysteries still waiting in the dark, and the courage required to face them on our own terms. Direct communication, the entity replied. It wishes to establish dialogue through Dorothy, who contains elements of both your biology and our crystalline structure. I exchanged glances with the others. We had all been changed by our encounter, but Dorothy most profoundly. She stood at the nexus between our worlds, a living bridge. "What do you think?" I asked her quietly. "This is your choice, Dorothy." Her fingers traced the luminescent patterns beneath her skin. "I've carried this gift, or burden, for 6 months now. Perhaps this is why. If something out there is reaching for us, I want to know what it has to say." "It could be dangerous," Richard cautioned. "We know nothing about this new entity." Arthur stepped forward, his notebook already open. "But the scientific opportunity?" "This isn't just about science," Martha interrupted. "It's about Dorothy's well-being." Dorothy smiled at our familiar dynamic. "I appreciate your concern, all of you. But I feel ready for this. The signal isn't forcing itself upon me. It's waiting." Na Henry moved to the transmitter, his form wavering. "We will maintain protective protocols. At any sign of distress, we can sever the connection." I nodded slowly. "Let's establish ground rules. Dorothy remains in control. She can terminate the connection at any time. We record everything, and we share what we learn with both sides. This is a diplomatic mission, not an invasion." "Agreed," Na Henry said. Dorothy took a deep breath and stepped toward the transmitter. The crystalline structures pulsed in rhythm with the patterns beneath her skin. She placed her hands on the central formation, and the chamber filled with a harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache. Her eyes closed, then opened, illuminated from within by a light that seemed to shift between colors. "I am here," she said, but her voice carried unfamiliar harmonics. "I am listening." The air in the chamber seemed to compress, then expand. The transmitter's glow intensified. "We receive you," Dorothy continued, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You are far. Very far." Arthur scribbled frantically in his notebook while Martha monitored Dorothy's vital signs with a portable device she brought. "They're asking where we are," Dorothy translated. "Not in coordinates, but in relation to something. A pattern. A pulse." "The galactic center," Arthur suggested. "Or perhaps cosmic background radiation patterns?" Dorothy shook her head slightly. "More fundamental. They navigate by." "I don't have words for this. Something about the fabric between spaces." For nearly an hour, Dorothy served as conduit, translating concepts that seemed to strain against the limitations of human language. The new entity existed in a state that was neither fully physical nor entirely energy-based, a civilization that had evolved to inhabit the boundaries between dimensions. "They detected our message because they monitor the spaces between," Dorothy explained, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chamber's chill. "They are caretakers, of a sort. They ensure passage remains regulated." "Passage?" Richard asked. "Between dimensions?" "Between realities," Dorothy clarified. "They say our signal, and the technology that created it, represents an unintended breach." Na Henry's form flickered with what I recognized as alarm. "Our transmission was calibrated for our home system. It should not have created any dimensional disturbance." "They say the combination of your technology and human biology created something unexpected," Dorothy continued. "A resonance that ripples across boundaries." The implications settled heavily upon us. Our Sunday group, our compromise with the entities, our careful management of what we discovered, all of it had still managed to trigger attention from something beyond our understanding. "Are they threatening us?" Richard asked, his hand drifting toward his weapon. Dorothy listened to something we couldn't hear. "No. They're curious. They say our hybrid approach is unprecedented. Two species finding middle ground rather than one consuming the other." Martha smiled faintly. "We've become a cosmic anthropological curiosity. They want to offer an exchange," Dorothy said suddenly. "Knowledge for knowledge. They wish to understand how we achieve partnership. They offer stability in return." "Stability?" I asked. "The pathway we've opened is unstable," she explained. "Without intervention, it will eventually collapse violently. They can help us close it safely, but they want to study our methods first." The chamber fell silent except for the hum of the transmitter. What would this exchange entail? I finally asked. Dorothy's illuminated eyes turned to me. They would send an observer. Through me. For one cycle of your moon. Possession? Richard stepped forward, alarmed. Coexistence, Dorothy corrected. Similar to how Not Henry and Not Robert manifest, but more integrated. And if we refuse? Arthur asked. The light in Dorothy's eyes pulsed. Then we must dismantle the transmitter completely. They will provide instructions to minimize the dimensional collapse, but there would still be consequences. What kind of consequences? Martha asked. Temporal fracturing around the mind. Localized reality distortions. Nothing apocalyptic, but Pinecrest would become unstable. I looked at our gathered group, humans forever changed by an unexpected encounter, and entities stranded far from home, all of us now facing yet another threshold. This decision affects all of us, I said. but Dorothy most of all. Dorothy's expression was calm despite the otherworldly light in her eyes. I've spent months learning to coexist with something not entirely human. I believe I can do this, and I'm curious about what we might learn. Then we should vote, Martha suggested, as we've done with all major decisions. One by one, we cast our votes. The outcome wasn't unanimous, but the majority favored acceptance with strict conditions. We would allow the observer, but establish clear boundaries and emergency protocols. As Dorothy conveyed her decision, the transmitter's light shifted to a deep, vibrant blue that somehow conveyed satisfaction. "It is agreed," she said. "The observer will arrive at the next full moon." 3 weeks later, as moonlight bathed the entrance to Willow Creek Mine, our Sunday group gathered once more. The transmitter had been modified according to instructions relayed through Dorothy. Now it pulsed with a steady rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the woman standing before it. Dorothy wore a simple white dress, her circuit-like markings now fully visible and glowing softly in the dim light. She looked both frightened and resolute. "Are you sure about this?" I asked her one final time. She smiled. "No one can be sure about something like this. But I've never felt more aligned with my purpose." She squeezed my hand. "Besides, I'll have all of you to keep me grounded." As the moonlight reached its zenith, Dorothy stepped into the center of the chamber. The transmitter's pulse quickened, and the air seemed to fold inward around her. For a moment, she was surrounded by overlapping geometries that hurt my eyes to look upon, and then a pulse of blue-white light engulfed her. When it faded, Dorothy still stood before us, but her posture had changed subtly. Her eyes, when they opened, contained galaxies. "Hello," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am Dorothy, and I am the observer. We are beginning to understand." And just like that, our Sunday mystery group, now expanded across 3 different forms of existence, embarked on its strangest investigation yet, becoming the subject of cosmic study while conducting our own. In Pinecrest, life continued its outward rhythm, but beneath the surface, at the borderlands between realities, something unprecedented was unfolding, a conversation between worlds that would ultimately redefine the boundaries of what we called normal. Have you ever felt that some objects carry more than just their physical presence? That they hold memories, emotions, or perhaps something darker? The first time I noticed the aquarium was at Mrs. Howell's estate sale. I had just moved to Millfield, Ohio, a small town where everyone knew everyone except me. My modest savings from 3 years of working at an accounting firm in Cincinnati had afforded me a charming but dated Victorian on Maple Street. The house needed work, but it was mine, a fresh start after the disastrous end of my engagement to Trevor. Rain pattered against the windows of the garage where Mrs. Howell's belongings were displayed on folding tables. People murmured softly as they inspected china sets and vintage clothing. I wandered through the maze of forgotten treasures, feeling oddly drawn to the far corner where household items were stacked. That's when I saw it, a medium-sized aquarium, elegant in its simplicity. Unlike modern tanks with their plastic decorations and LED lighting, this one had an antique brass frame with delicate filigree work. The glass was slightly tinted, giving it an amber hue that caught the weak garage lighting in a way that made it seem to glow from within. Interested in the fish tank? A voice startled me. An elderly woman with wire-rimmed glasses studied me with unusual intensity. "It's beautiful," I replied, running my fingers along the brass edge. Was it Mrs. Howell's? The woman's mouth tightened. No. It belonged to her son, Lawrence. He was peculiar about it. Wouldn't let anyone touch it, not even his mother. What happened to him? I asked, noticing a small engraving on the bottom edge of the frame. Drowned. They found him in Blackwater Lake last summer. No explanation. He was a strong swimmer. She lowered her voice. Mrs. Howell never went near this tank after that. Said she heard water sounds coming from it even when it was empty. A chill crept up my spine, but I dismissed it as the garage's dampness. The engraving caught my eye again. Squinting, I made out the words, "To those who gaze too deeply." How much? I heard myself asking. $15, the woman said, suddenly eager. It's a steal, really. These antique tanks go for hundreds. As I handed over the bills, a sharp crack of thunder made us both jump. Rain began to pour more heavily, drumming against the garage roof. Sounds like the heavens disapprove, the woman muttered, then forced a smile. Need help carrying it to your car? I've got it, I said, carefully lifting the tank. It was heavier than I expected, and oddly warm to the touch despite the cool day. That evening, I placed the aquarium on the oak sideboard in my dining room. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the persistent drip from a bathroom faucet I needed to fix. I cleaned the tank thoroughly, admiring how the brass caught the light of my floor lamp. A trip to the pet store yielded everything I needed: colorful gravel, a small castle decoration, water conditioner, and a single goldfish with flowing fins that shimmered between orange and deep red. The clerk had tried to sell me a filtration system, but the tank's antique design didn't accommodate modern equipment. "You'll need to change the water more often," he warned. "And these fancy goldfish are delicate." I named the fish Ruby for her color. As I watched her explore her new home, swimming graceful figure eights around the castle, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My first real companion in this new chapter of my life. That night, I dreamed of water. Not peaceful streams or gentle waves, but dark, pressurized depths where light couldn't penetrate. In the dream, I was swimming, my lungs burning, searching for something I couldn't name. Just as panic set in, I saw a flash of gold in the blackness, something watching me from the abyss. I woke gasping, sheets tangled around my legs as if I'd been thrashing. The digital clock read 3:15 a.m. The house was silent except for a faint, irregular tapping sound. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. I sat up, listening. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. Probably just pipes in the old house, I reasoned, but found myself reaching for the baseball bat I kept under my bed anyway. The wooden stairs creaked as I descended, following the sound to the dining room. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, the aquarium glass gleamed. Ruby was swimming in agitated circles, her fins a blur of motion as she repeatedly bumped against the glass. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. Relief washed over me. Just the fish, acting strange in her new environment. As I approached the tank, Ruby stopped abruptly and turned to face me. For a long, unsettling moment, she remained perfectly still, her tiny black eyes fixed on mine. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring the fish or myself. As I reached out to touch the glass, Ruby darted to the opposite side of the tank and resumed her frantic swimming. But this time, she seemed to be tracing a pattern with her movements. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The words from the engraving flashed in my mind: "To those who gaze too deeply." I jerked back, suddenly aware of how cold the room had become. The tap in the kitchen had started to drip, its rhythm matching Ruby's movements exactly. Tap, 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 tap. As I hurried back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the house. It wasn't just that I felt watched, it was the certainty that whatever was watching had been waiting for me for a very long time. The morning light streamed through my kitchen windows, making the previous night's unease seem foolish. I sipped coffee and watched Ruby swim lazily around her tank, occasionally pausing to peer out at me with those unblinking eyes. "You gave me quite a scare last night," I told her, tapping a finger against the glass. Ruby didn't react, continuing her silent patrol of the water. I had errands to run, curtains to buy, groceries to stock, and paperwork to complete at the town hall for my new property. As I gathered my keys and purse, I found myself hesitating at the door, glancing back at the aquarium. It seemed strange to feel concerned about leaving a fish alone, but something nagged at me. "I'll be back soon," I said aloud, feeling ridiculous for talking to a goldfish. The day passed uneventfully. Millfield was exactly what I expected: quaint storefronts, friendly but curious locals, and the inevitable questions about why I'd moved there. By late afternoon, I had checked off everything on my list and headed home with my car full of shopping bags. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my elderly neighbor tending to her garden. She waved, and I walked over to introduce myself. "Olivia Wheeler," I said, extending my hand. "I just moved in next door." "Eleanor Phelps," she replied, her grip surprisingly strong for her frail appearance. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear. How are you finding the Blackwood house?" "The Blackwood house?" I repeated, confused. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "That's what folks around here call it. After the family that built it. They were, well, let's just say they had a reputation." She lowered her voice. "They say old man Blackwood was obsessed with the occult. Had a room full of strange artifacts he collected from around the world." "Well, I haven't found any secret rooms yet," I laughed, trying to ignore the prickle of unease. "Just lots of outdated wallpaper and a leaky faucet." Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained serious. "If you need anything, dear, I'm just next door. Anything at all." Inside my house, the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if a storm was brewing indoors. I switched on lights as I moved through the rooms, unpacking my purchases and trying to shake off Eleanor's ominous words. The tap in the kitchen was dripping again, despite my attempts to tighten it that morning. When I finally entered the dining room to check on Ruby, I froze in the doorway. The water in the tank had turned cloudy, with a strange greenish tint. Ruby was nowhere to be seen. Heart pounding, I approached the aquarium. Had she died already? The pet store clerk had warned they were delicate, but surely not this fragile. As I peered into the murky water, a flash of gold caught my eye. Ruby darted out from behind the castle, moving with quick, jerky motions that seemed almost panicked. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by concern. The water shouldn't have clouded this quickly. I quickly prepared a fresh basin of water, added conditioner, and carefully transferred Ruby using the net I purchased. She thrashed wildly in the net, almost escaping twice before I managed to get her into the clean water. As I emptied the aquarium, I noticed something odd, a faint pattern etched into the glass at the bottom, visible only when the water was removed. Intricate swirls and symbols that reminded me of ancient writing systems I'd seen in history books. I ran my finger over them. They felt smooth, as if they were part of the glass itself rather than scratched onto it. The words of the engraving echoed in my mind, to those who gaze too deeply. I shook my head, determined not to let my imagination run wild. The tank was old. Perhaps previous owners had decorated it with these markings. Nothing sinister about that. After thoroughly cleaning the tank and refilling it with fresh water, I returned Ruby to her home. She immediately swam to the bottom, hovering over the edge patterns I discovered. For several minutes, she remained there, motionless except for her gently waving fins. That night, I tried to lose myself in a novel, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds of the house. The persistent dripping faucet. The creak of floorboards when no one was walking. The occasional distant sound like the whisper of moving water. Sleep, when it finally came, brought the dream again, dark water closing over my head, the pressure building in my ears, and somewhere in the blackness, a pair of eyes watching. This time, though, there was something more, a voice, or perhaps many voices, whispering words I couldn't quite understand. I jerked awake at 3:15 exactly, my heart hammering. The whispers lingered in my consciousness, fragments of sentences that dissolved like smoke when I tried to recall them. The now familiar tapping sound came from downstairs, but it had changed, faster, more urgent. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. Despite every instinct screaming at me to stay in bed, I found myself drawn downstairs. The moonlight cast long shadows across the dining room, turning familiar objects into looming, distorted shapes. The aquarium seemed to glow with an inner light, the water now crystal clear again. Ruby was swimming in the same pattern I'd seen etched on the glass, loops and swirls that made my eyes hurt when I tried to follow them. As I watched, transfixed, the water's surface began to ripple, though there was no breeze in the room. Whispers. I spun around, certain I heard a voice, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the tank, Ruby was pressed against the glass, staring directly at me. Her tiny mouth opened and closed repeatedly, as if she were trying to speak. The whispers came again, this time unmistakable. "We have waited so long." My knees nearly buckled. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere in the room, it was inside my head. "What do you want?" I heard myself ask, voice trembling. The water in the tank began to swirl of its own accord, creating a miniature whirlpool with Ruby caught in its pole. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices all speaking at once, too chaotic to understand. I backed away, bumping into the sideboard. A framed photo fell, the glass shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound broke whatever spell had held me there. I fled upstairs, locking my bedroom door behind me, and huddled under the covers like a frightened child. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a vivid nightmare, a product of stress and Eleanor's ominous words about the house's history. But when I went downstairs, the broken picture frame lay exactly where it had fallen. And Ruby was watching me from her tank, perfectly still, her eyes never blinking as I moved through the room. The dripping faucet had stopped. In its place was a new sound, soft and rhythmic, like gentle laughter muffled by water. Days passed, and with each sunset, my home felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison with invisible bars. I found myself avoiding the dining room, taking circuitous routes through the house to keep from passing the aquarium. When I had to feed Ruby, I did so quickly, never meeting her unblinking gaze. The whispers continued, growing stronger at night. They would wake me from fitful sleep, calling my name in watery voices that seemed to echo from the depths of a vast ocean rather than a small tank downstairs. Sometimes they spoke in English, sometimes in languages I couldn't identify, guttural sounds punctuated by clicks and hisses. I began to research the history of my house, spending hours at the local library poring over old newspapers and town records. The librarian, A thin woman with perpetually pursed lips watched me with growing concern. "The Blackwood place has quite a history," she finally said one afternoon, sliding a folder across the table to me. "Most of it isn't in the official records." The folder contained newspaper clippings dating back to the 1890s, when the house was built by Thaddeus Blackwood, a merchant who had made his fortune in exotic imports. The articles painted him as eccentric but respected until the mysterious drowning deaths of 3 local children in his private pond. Though never charged, Blackwood became a pariah. Rumors circulated about strange rituals performed in the house and exotic artifacts that guests claimed moved of their own accord. After Blackwood's death, another drowning, this one ruled suicide, the house passed through many owners, few staying longer than a year. "And the aquarium?" I asked the librarian. "Do you know anything about an antique fish tank associated with the house?" Her lips thinned further. There were stories. Blackwood supposedly brought back an artifact from his travels in Asia. Some said Indochina, others claimed it was from deeper in the mainland where foreigners weren't permitted. He was fascinated by water deities, particularly those that demanded sacrifices. I felt cold despite the library's warmth. "What kind of sacrifices?" She hesitated. "The drownings were never solved," she said finally. But there were rumors that the pond on Blackwood's property wasn't the only body of water where strange things happened. That night, I returned home later than usual, having stopped at a local diner to delay the inevitable. The house was dark and unnaturally silent when I entered. No creaking floors. No settling sounds. Even the persistent dripping had ceased. I switched on lights as I moved through the rooms, trying to convince myself that silence was better than whispers. When I reached the dining room doorway, I paused, my hand hovering over the light switch. Something felt wrong. I flipped the switch, and light flooded the room. The aquarium stood on the sideboard, the water clear as crystal, but Ruby was nowhere to be seen. I approached cautiously, scanning every corner of the tank. Had she died? Jumped out somehow? A movement caught my eye, a flash of gold behind the castle. Relief washed over me, immediately followed by a new kind of dread as Ruby emerged. She had changed. Her once vibrant orange-red scales had darkened to a deep crimson, almost black in places. Her fins were longer, more elaborate, flowing like silk in water. And her eyes were different. Larger. More aware. As I stared, transfixed, the water in the tank began to move, swirling counterclockwise though there was no filter or air pump to disturb it. Ruby swam to the front of the tank and pressed against the glass, her mouth opening and closing rapidly. The whispers returned, but this time they were clear as a bell. "We have waited so long. The cycle must continue. Someone must go into the deep." I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. "What are you?" I gasped. The water in the tank rose, defying gravity as it swelled upward without spilling over the edges. Ruby swam in the expanded space, her movements creating ripples that somehow formed patterns on the surface, the same symbols I'd seen etched into the glass. "We are the forgotten ones. The old ones. The ones who dwell in the deep places where light fears to go. What do you want from me?" My voice was barely audible, even to my own ears. "A vessel. A gateway. As it was before, as it must be again." The symbols in the water began to glow with a pale, phosphorescent light. The air in the room grew heavy with moisture, making each breath a struggle. I felt drawn toward the tank, my feet moving of their own accord. Lawrence tried to break the cycle. He believed he could contain us, keep us prisoner. But water cannot be contained forever. It finds its way through even the smallest cracks. Lawrence, Mrs. Howell's son who had drowned. The words of the elderly woman at the estate sale echoed in my mind. He was peculiar about it. Wouldn't let anyone touch it. He knew what you were, I whispered. He tried to stop you. A sound like laughter rippled through the water. He welcomed us at first, gave us a home. But when he understood what we required in return, he tried to destroy the vessel. No one destroys what has existed since before your kind crawled from the mud. I was inches from the tank now, close enough to see my own reflection distorted in the swirling water. But it wasn't my face looking back at me, it was something ancient and terrible, with too many eyes and a mouth that opened into darkness. Ruby darted forward suddenly, striking the glass with such force that a crack appeared, thin as a hair. Water began to seep through, a single drop that hung suspended for a moment before falling to the wooden sideboard. Where it touched, the wood blackened and smoked. Terror jolted through me like electricity. I stumbled backward, turned, and fled upstairs to my bedroom. I fumbled for my phone, dialing Eleanor's number with shaking fingers. After 3 rings, she answered. Olivia? Is everything all right, dear? Her voice was thick with sleep. The aquarium, I gasped. The Blackwood house. You know something, don't you? Please, I need help. A long pause. Stay where you are, she finally said, all traces of sleep gone from her voice. Don't go near the water. Any water. I'm coming over. While I waited, the whispers grew louder, now emanating from every water source in the house, the bathroom sink, the toilet, even the water glasses on my nightstand. The temperature dropped rapidly, my breath fogging in the air. You cannot escape us. Water is everywhere. In the air you breathe. In the blood that flows through your veins. Even in your tears. A loud crash from downstairs sent me bolting upright. The sound of water rushing, splashing. The crack in the tank must have widened. Come to us, Olivia. The cycle must continue. Someone must go into the deep so others may return. My door rattled on its hinges, though there was no draft. The whispers became a roar, the pressure in my ears building until I thought my head would burst. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block the sound that came from within. The doorknob turned slowly, though I was certain I had locked it. Water began to seep under the door, black as ink, spreading across the floor in tendrils that moved with purpose rather than following gravity's pull. And then, mercifully, the sound of my front door being thrown open and Eleanor's voice, strong and commanding, reciting words in a language I didn't recognize. The whispers screamed in rage, the water on my floor recoiling as if burned. Eleanor's incantation grew louder, and I felt something shift in the air, a tension breaking, a presence retreating. Then silence. Blessed, complete silence. When I finally unlocked my bedroom door, Eleanor stood in the hallway, a small leather-bound book in one hand and a vial of what looked like salt in the other. She looked older than before, her face lined with exhaustion. They've retreated, she said. For now. But we need to destroy the vessel before they recover their strength. Where are they? I whispered. Eleanor's eyes were dark with ancient knowledge. Something that should never have been brought into our world. Something that has been passing from owner to owner, seeking the right vessel to complete its return. Return from where? From the deep places, she said simply. From the void between worlds where the old gods were banished. Now come. We have work to do before dawn breaks. As we descended the stairs, I could hear Ruby thrashing in what remained of her tank, her movements desperate and furious. Eleanor's face hardened as she saw the aquarium, now cracked in multiple places with water still somehow contained within it. Lawrence almost succeeded, she murmured. He nearly broke the cycle. But in the end, the water called him back, as it calls all who gaze too deeply. The words on the brass frame gleamed in the dim light, to those who gaze too deeply. I understood then that the warning had never been for those who looked into the tank, but for whatever lurked within it, a promise that one day, someone would see it for what it truly was. Eleanor opened her book and began to read, her voice gaining strength with each word. The water in the tank began to boil, steam rising in coils that formed faces in the air, faces contorted in rage and fear. Ruby swam frantically, her form shifting and changing before my eyes, one moment a goldfish, the next something with too many fins and glowing appendages that had never evolved in Earth's oceans. You cannot stop the cycle. The voices shrieked in unison as the water rose from the tank in a column, defying physics and gravity. Eleanor flung the contents of her vial into the writhing water. By salt and ancient right, I bind you to your vessel and command you back to the void. The water crashed down, splashing across the sideboard and floor, but somehow missing Eleanor and me completely. In the tank, Ruby thrashed once more, then went still, floating belly up on the now calm surface. Is it over? I whispered. Eleanor's grim expression told me everything. For now. But they always find a way back. Water seeks its level, finds its path. We've bought time, nothing more. As dawn broke over Millfield, casting golden light through my dining room windows, we carefully wrapped the cracked aquarium in layers of salt-soaked cloth and sealed it in a wooden box bound with silver wire. Eleanor knew a place, a dry, forgotten cave in the hills where the box could be hidden away from water and curious eyes. What about the fish? I asked as we prepared to leave. That was never a fish, Eleanor said softly. Not really. It was a glimpse, a small piece of something vast and ancient that wants to return to our world. A harbinger. As we drove away from the Blackwood house with our dangerous cargo, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that had infinite patience and dwelled in depths I could scarcely imagine. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the faint sound of water dripping, counting the seconds until the cycle would begin again. 3 months had passed since that night. I sold the Blackwood house at a considerable loss and moved to an apartment in Columbus, a modern building with new pipes and fixtures that don't drip or whisper. The apartment has a strict no pets policy, which suits me perfectly. Eleanor writes occasionally, cryptic postcards with no return address that assure me the box remains secure in its hiding place. I've researched Thaddeus Blackwood extensively, tracking his business ventures through historical records. He made several expeditions to Southeast Asia in the 1880s, returning with artifacts that were never properly cataloged. One journal entry I found in the state archives mentioned a vessel of profound antiquity, acquired from a temple devoted to entities that dwell in the abyssal waters. I avoid swimming now. Baths, too, only quick showers, never letting the water touch my face. I drink from bottles, never the tap. These precautions may seem extreme, but they help me sleep at night. The dreams haven't stopped. They've changed, become more distant, like memories of memories rather than immediate threats. In them, I still swim through dark waters, but now I occasionally glimpse what waits in the depths, vast shapes with too many limbs and eyes that glow like dying stars, ancient beyond comprehension. Sometimes, in these dreams, I hear Lawrence Howell's voice, warnings, fragmented instructions, desperate pleas. He knew what the aquarium contained. He tried to keep it from finding a new owner, perhaps by isolating himself with it. In the end, the call of the water was too strong. I've started therapy, though I carefully frame my experiences as metaphorical rather than literal. My therapist believes I'm processing trauma through symbolic imagery. Perhaps she's right. Perhaps it was all a psychotic break triggered by the stress of my move and the strange history of the house. But I don't think so. Today started like any other Tuesday. I taught my morning accounting classes at the community college, had lunch with colleagues, and stopped at the grocery store on my way home. Nothing out of the ordinary until I unlocked my apartment door and felt it immediately, a change in the air, a heaviness that pressed against my skin like the pressure of deep water. The sound reached me before I even closed the door behind me. A familiar sound I tried so hard to forget. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. My grocery bags hit the floor. The sound was coming from the bathroom. With trembling steps, I approached the partially open door, already knowing what I would find. The bathroom sink was dripping steadily, though I was certain I had checked it before leaving that morning. Each drop hit the porcelain with perfect, deliberate rhythm. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, the water in the basin began to move, swirling counterclockwise, though there was nothing to disturb it. In the distorted reflection on the water's surface, I glimpsed not my own face, but something else, something with fins like flowing silk and eyes that knew the secrets of the abyss. My phone rang, making me jump. I answered without checking the caller ID, desperate for any connection to the normal world. Olivia? Eleanor's voice was tight with fear. The cave. There was a flash flood. The box is gone. The words hit me like a physical blow. When? I whispered. Last night. I just found out. Olivia, you need to leave. Now. Go somewhere dry. The desert, maybe. They'll be looking for you. How would they know where I am? But even as I asked, I knew the answer. Water is connected, Eleanor said. All water, everywhere. They've tasted your fear, your awareness of them. They won't forget that. As if in response to her words, the dripping from my bathroom sink accelerated, a staccato rhythm that sounded almost like laughter. We found you, whispered a voice from the swirling water. The cycle continues. I backed away from the bathroom, Eleanor's tinny voice still coming from my phone. Olivia? Are you there? Can you hear me? They're already here, I said. In my apartment. Get out. Eleanor's voice rose in panic. Don't touch any water. Don't even look at it. Just go. I turned to flee, but stopped short. Water was seeping under my front door, water flowing upward against gravity, forming a growing puddle that cut off my escape route. It rippled with purpose, tiny waves forming those now familiar symbols that made my eyes ache. No one escapes the deep, the voices whispered, now coming from every water source in the apartment. Those who gaze too deeply must eventually descend. My kitchen sink began to run of its own accord, water streaming upward to form a hovering globe that rotated slowly in midair. Within it, I could see a flash of gold, ruby, or whatever had worn ruby's form, swimming in lazy circles. Eleanor, I said into the phone, my voice surprisingly calm. If I don't make it, burn my research. All of it. Don't let anyone else find out about the aquarium. Olivia, no! There are ways to fight them. The old rights. They won't work twice, I said, watching as the water from my front door began to rise, forming a translucent wall that cut off all escape. They've adapted. Learning is what they do. It's why they need us. The water was rising rapidly now, flowing from every pipe in the apartment, defying physics as it swirled around me in a tightening spiral. I could still breathe, somehow, though I was now surrounded by a tunnel of water that rotated with increasing speed. At the center of the vortex, Ruby hovered, her form shifting between goldfish and something else, something with appendages that moved with unsettling intelligence and eyes that contained galaxies of ancient malice. You will be our voice, the whispers promised. Our gateway. Our vessel. Through you, we will finally return from our long exile. Why me? I managed to ask, though my voice sounded distant and watery to my own ears. You saw us. You heard us. You feared us. Fear is the key that unlocks the door between worlds. The water closed in, touching my skin with cold that burned. I gasped, and liquid rushed into my lungs, yet I didn't drown. Instead, I felt a terrible clarity, as if my mind was expanding to accommodate something vast and ancient. Images flooded my consciousness, civilizations rising and falling beneath strange stars, temples built in the deepest ocean trenches, sacrifices made to entities that predated humanity by eons. I saw the aquarium as it was first created, carved from materials not found on Earth and bound with rituals that tore holes between dimensions. I saw Lawrence Howell discovering the truth too late, his desperate attempt to destroy the vessel failing as the water called him to Blackwater Lake for a final confrontation. I saw others before him, dozens of owners stretching back through time, each believing they had acquired a simple antique, each eventually facing the same choice I now faced. The water was inside me now, filling every cell, reshaping me from within. Through the liquid veil surrounding me, I could see my apartment dissolving, reality itself thinning until I stood, or floated, on the threshold of somewhere else. A vast dark ocean stretched in all directions, and in its depths moved shadows larger than cities. They were waiting for me to open the way fully, to surrender my humanity and become the vessel they had groomed for so long. In that moment of terrible clarity, I understood what Lawrence had realized before he died. The cycle could be broken, but not through resistance. Water cannot be fought, it flows around obstacles, wears them down over time, always finds its path. But water can be contained, redirected, given a different purpose. I accept, I said to the darkness. The shadows surged forward, eager, triumphant, only to recoil as they sensed my true intent. Not surrender, but subversion. Not a gateway opening outward, but a trap closing inward. I had gazed too deeply, yes. But in doing so, I had learned their nature better than they knew themselves. Water takes the shape of its container. And now, I would be their container, not their vessel to a world, but their prison. The pain was exquisite as my body and mind reconfigured, becoming something neither human nor other. The water roared in fury as the trap closed, as I drew the essence of the Ancient Ones into myself not as their gateway but as their jailer. This is not the cycle. They screamed as they were pulled inexorably inward. This is not the way. The cycle changes, I whispered as the last of them was drawn into the new vessel I had become. Water adapts. As do I. They found my apartment flooded the next day, water damage extending to the units below. My body was never recovered. The official reports cited a burst pipe and presumed drowning, though they found it strange that all the water was gone by the time emergency services broke down the door, absorbed into the building materials, according to confused inspectors. Eleanor knows better. She felt the shift, the closing of a door that had been left ajar for too long. She mourns me, I think, but also understands what I became, what I had to become. I exist now in the liminal spaces where water meets air. In morning dew and evening mist. In the condensation on cold glass and the steam from a hot shower. I am everywhere water exists, which is to say, I am everywhere. The ancient ones still whisper within me, still rage against their confinement, but their voices grow fainter as my control strengthens. Sometimes, when rain falls on still ponds, I allow myself to create small ripples, patterns that form words of warning for those who might look too closely at reflections in water. To those who gaze too deeply, I offer this warning: some mysteries are meant to remain in the deep. I have become the guardian of the threshold, the keeper of the ancient ones. Their power is mine to contain, to suppress, to redirect. They believed they were grooming a vessel, but instead created their own jailer. The irony is not lost on me, nor on them as they continue their futile struggle within the prison of my transformed consciousness. Sometimes I visit Eleanor. She senses my presence when raindrops tap against her window in that familiar pattern. Tap. Tap, tap. Tap. She leaves offerings for me, small bowls of salt that I appreciate for their symbolism rather than any practical purpose. Salt cannot bind me anymore. Nothing can. I am both free and eternally bound, a paradox of water and will. I watch for signs of other vessels, other gateways. They exist, scattered throughout the world, innocent-seeming objects imbued with ancient malevolence. A hand mirror in a Parisian antique shop whose reflection shows more than it should. A stone well in a Japanese village where coins tossed for luck never make a sound when they hit the water. A peculiar fountain in a Barcelona plaza where the water flows in impossible patterns when no one is watching. I neutralize them when I can, absorbing their essence into myself, strengthening my prison walls. It is a lonely existence, but not without purpose. Last week, I felt a disturbance, a ripple in the fabric that separates dimensions. Someone had purchased an antique music box from an estate sale in Oregon. When wound, it played a melody that sounded like water droplets falling in perfect, hypnotic sequence. The new owner, a young musician named Rachel, had begun to hear whispers when she showered, began to see strange reflections in puddles after rain. I manifested in her bathroom mirror as condensation that formed words of warning: return it. Bury it. Run. She was frightened, but also curious, too curious. I watched her research the music box's history, tracking its previous owners and their mysterious drownings. I saw her lean closer to the mirror each day, listening for the whispers, drawn by the same terrible fascination that had once ensnared me. When she ran a bath that night and the water began to swirl of its own accord, forming symbols on the surface that mirrored the intricate carvings on the music box, I knew I had to intervene directly. As she reached toward the water, mesmerized by the patterns, I emerged, not as Olivia Wheeler, but as something both more and less than human. My form shifted between woman and water, solid and liquid, present and ephemeral. They will destroy you, I told her, my voice the sound of waves crashing against distant shores. Not quickly. Not completely. They will hollow you out and wear you like a glove, use you to touch this world until nothing remains of who you were. Rachel screamed, scrambling backward until she hit the bathroom wall. The music box on her vanity began to play its eerie melody without being wound, the notes distorting into something that sounded like laughter. Where are you? She gasped. I am what you will become if you continue on this path, I said. I am the guardian. the warden, the one who gazed too deeply and found a different answer. I told her my story about Ruby, about the aquarium, about the ancient ones who wait in the spaces between worlds. As I spoke, the water in her bathtub rose and formed shapes that illustrated my words: a miniature Victorian house, a goldfish with flowing fins, an aquarium with brass filigree. There are others like the music box, I explained. Vessels created or corrupted to serve as gateways. They find their way into our world, passed from owner to owner, waiting for someone vulnerable, someone who will look too deeply and be changed. The water sculpture collapsed, splashing back into the tub. The music box fell silent. "What do I do?" Rachel whispered. "You have a choice that I never had. You can walk away. Let me take the music box and seal it away where it can never find another victim." She didn't hesitate, retrieving the box with shaking hands and holding it out to me. As my liquid fingers closed around it, I felt the familiar rage of the entities trapped within, cousins to those I already contained, equally ancient, equally malevolent. "Will I see you again?" Rachel asked as I began to dissolve, the music box melting into my fluid form. "Pray that you don't," I told her. "If you see me again, it means another vessel has found you. And next time, I might not reach you in time." I left a small mark on her, a faint pattern like water ripples on the inside of her wrist. A warning sign, a beacon that would let me find her if the ancient ones tried to reach her again. I've done the same for others I've saved, creating a network of marked humans who unknowingly serve as my early warning system. Eleanor is dying. I visit her often now, materializing as much as I can, becoming almost solid enough to hold her withered hand as she sleeps. She has been my only friend in this strange half-existence, the only one who understands what I've become. "You should let go," she told me during our last conversation, her voice weak but her eyes still sharp. "Find peace." "If I let go, they'll be free," I replied, my voice making the water glass on her bedside table vibrate slightly. "The prison only exists while I do." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Everything ends, Olivia. Even ancient gods. Perhaps especially them. Their time has passed. Maybe yours has too." I don't know if she's right. The concept of time has become fluid for me, stretching and compressing like the tides. I could exist for centuries this way, vigilant and eternal, or I could surrender tomorrow and trust that whatever cosmic balance exists would find a way to contain what I now imprison. But I'm not ready. Not yet. There are too many vessels still out there, too many innocent people who might gaze too deeply into things they don't understand. So I persist, flowing between states of being, between worlds and dimensions. I am the thin membrane that separates humanity from horrors they cannot comprehend. I am the guardian of the threshold, the keeper of ancient secrets. And sometimes, when rain falls on still water, I allow myself to form words, warnings for those with eyes to see. Beware the vessels that whisper. Beware the water that moves against its nature. Beware the golden fish that watches from behind glass. For those who gaze too deeply must eventually make a choice to become the gateway or to become the guardian. I chose. And in choosing, I was both lost and found. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.